זכות גדולה שלנו, רשות הטבע והגנים, לארח אתכם. המון אנשים שעוסקים במקצוע מדהים. אני נחשפתי למקצוע הזה רק בשנים האחרונות. זכיתי להחליף את מודי בפיתוח ולעבוד ביחד עם זאב ודורי וצוות השימור, ובכלל עם משמרים. יש פה גם אנשים שעבדתי איתם, וחלק שעוד נעבוד ביחד. ראיתי פה החבר'ה של ארקו, נכון, ובן, ועוד, חלק מהאנשים אני לא מכיר. לאחל לכם קודם כל שיהיה לכם יום מקסים ותהנו. מגדל צדק נפתח לפני שנה, עברו פה כבר למעלה מ100,000 מבקרים. אתם יותר בחומר, אבל אנחנו גם מעבר לחומר מאוד מאוד רוצים להמשיך ולפתח ולשמר וליצור בתוך המצודה. זהו, אנחנו בימים אלו מקימים שם חדר מולטימדיה מתקציב של משרד מורשת בכניסה למצודה, בחדר הצלבני אתם תראו אותו, ובאחרונה עשינו שם קצת עבודות רגע לחזק את המבנה באזורים שעוד רגע הלכו ליפול, וסך הכל המקום עובד ומתפקד ויפה, ושנמשיך לעשות וליצור, ושיהיה לכם בהצלחה ותבואו לבקר, זה הכי חשוב.
גם ליזום. ולדוגמה, אני מדי פעם לא טורח יותר מדי לבלבל לכם את המוח, אבל לדוגמה, ראיתם את המאמר שהיה בעיתון הקבלן עלינו, על המשמרים. הרעיון היה שזאת תהיה כתבה ראשונה, אבל למי שיש פרויקט מעניין, אולי קצת יותר בתחום ההיסטוריה, והוא מעוניין, הוא יכול לקבל במה שם, וזה פשוט חושף אותנו. ודיברנו לא פעם שחלק מהחשיפה שלנו, מה שרצינו לעשות את ה-Open for Conservation, שאנחנו אנשי המפתח בשימור, ואני לא אומר את זה בשביל להגיד את זה, אנחנו באמת, המשמר הוא האיש הקשר, הוא הדבק, גם בתוך הפרויקט עצמו, אבל גם כלפי הקהילה. ועשינו גם יום אחד, אתם גם קיבלתם את המידע, יום השתלמות, טיילנו בקיסריה בעקבות השימור והמשמר, עם אנשים שהם לא משמרים, והחוויה היא פשוט בלתי רגילה, אנשים צמאים להבין מה זה השימור הזה, ויש לנו המון מה להציע. לכן, אז אני קורא לכם באמת, יש לכם איזה רעיון, השתלמות מיוחדת שאתם רוצים לעשות, תעלו, יש לנו ועדה מתפקדת, אנחנו נפגשים אחת לכמה, וצירפנו לוועדה, צירפנו כמה צעירים חדשים, איתן, הכי צעיר, איתן תלה, וגם טלי הצטרפה, ויותם, וישו בוועדה, ודייוויד, ועדי, ויונתן, ומי עוד? רובן כמובן, רובן, זה המנוע רובן, כן?
נותן בראש בחצי.
וזהו, ואנחנו באמת, וקימי פה, ואורית שלא הגיעה, שכחתי מישהו? לא, 10 אנשים, ובאמת, כל מה שאנחנו רוצים, כמובן זו ועדה מתנדבת, כל מה שאנחנו רוצים באמת לקדם את השימור, ואני חושב שמשהו קורה מאוד וגידים. זהו, אז אני רוצה לראות אם אמרתי הכל. בסוף. לא, אז זהו, זה בסוף. עכשיו, חוץ מזה חלק מאיתנו נרשמו לאיקומוס, בגלל שאנחנו לא גוף רשמי, אנחנו רוצים להקים שם ועדה של משמרים, כל מי שמעוניין להצטרף, וולקאם, רק נשמח, ובאמת זה גם ניתן לנו איזה גושפנקה, כשאת באים למשהו רשמי, אז אפשר לבוא בתור משהו רשמי שמוכר במדינה, אז אנחנו באיקומוס. ודבר אחרון, עוד כמה דברים שקורים, אבל תראו, הכנתי פה מראש, אתם זוכרים, דיברתי איתכם לא כבר בכמה אירועים דיברתי איתכם על הדבר הזה. אתם זוכרים את זה? קסדות הכחולות. כן, זה כוח מענה בשעת חירום בכל נושא שהיערכות לרעידות אדמה, שיהיה מורכב ממשמרים, וזה חידוש עולמי, אני אומר לכם. כי היום הקסדות הכחולות בעולם, בדרך כלל זה כל מיני אנשי צבא, משטרה, עשו להם השתלמות חודש, והם הולכים להציל את אתרי המורשת. ואני חושב, יחד, כולנו חושבים ככה, שאם המשמרים יהיו בכוח הזה, אז הם כבר מכירים את המקומות, זה אנשים שמפוזרים בכל הארץ, הם יודעים לעבוד, מכירים את הטכנולוגיות הקדומות, אז זה ייתן המון, וכרגע יש כבר כספים שעברו, זה כרגע יושב ברשות הטבע והגנים, ואנחנו הולכים להקים את הכוח.
אפשר להחליף את הצלע?
עכשיו, למה אני אומר את זה כאן? חוץ מהדבר הרעיון, מי שמעוניין להיות חלק מהכוח הזה, זה כוח התנדבותי, שנעשה איזה אימון הקמה, הכוונה לעשות את זה עם הכבאות וההצלה האיטלקים, שלהם יש את הניסיון בדבר הזה, אז מי שמעוניין להיות חלק מהכוח הזה, אז כבר אפשר לפנות אליי, יהיו בגדול שלושה צוותים, צפון דרום מרכז, 12 איש בצוות, וניפגש פעמיים בשנה אחרי שנקים, אולי בהקמה זה ייקח קצת יותר, אבל מי שרוצה, שירים אצבע, קיצור שישלח לי איזה מייל או וואטסאפ, ואני ארשום אותו ברשימה, אני מקווה שזה יהיה בסוף השנה, תחילת השנה הבאה, אז זהו.
עכשיו קשור לקורס שר שאז היה?
קורס שר זה גם אחד מהמרכיבים של הקמת הכוח הזה. מי השתתף בקורס שר? כמה מכם? 1, 2, זהו. עיון שם 25, אורית הייתה. אוקיי, זהו. אז אנחנו עוברים לצד ששמו התכנסנו. עד שהבחור נייג'ל קופסי, אותם יציגו אותו, וגם זו יוזמה ברוכה של קנטאור, שאותם מנהל מחלקת השימור. הם הביאו את האורח הזה בכל הנושא שמתעסקים בו הרבה זמן כבר בהדרכות, לבד התרשמו ממנו, אבל את ההקדמה שגמרו לאכול בגלל שהיה שם כל מיני עיכובים, אז אלי יציג לנו את הנושא בכמה מילים, ואז נייג'ל ימשיך, אוקיי? אז שיהיה יום מענה ושאלות בדרך, יהיה לנו זמן לתחקיר כל היום.
קודם כל, הגדרה קצרה, רק שנדע על מה אנחנו מדברים. תערובת חמה זה תערובת שמערבבים את הסיד והאגרגטים בזמן שהסיד עוד חם. חם מהתהליך של הכיבוי. זה יכול להיות לפני שמכבים ואז הכיבוי הוא ביחד עם האגרגטים, זה יכול להיות מיד אחרי שמכבים, זה יכול להיות בזמן שמכבים. זה לא תערובת אחת, זה שיטת ערבוב. יש תערובות, תערובות חמות שישמשו לחומר בנייה, לטיח, לקלקולים, לצבע, ליים ראש, הזרקות, לכל השימושים. זאת בעצם הייתה השיטה הרווחת בצורה כמעט בלעדית שהשתמשו בה. ואפשר להשתמש בה לכל שימושים, עם כל סוג האגרגטים. בקצרה, מה שהתחיל את כל הדבר הזה זה אולי לא מה שהתחיל, אבל אני בטוח שכמו אני מרגיש, מגיע לקירות, אני מרגיש שהחומר שאני עובד איתו מאוד רחוק מהחומר שאני פוגש בתוך הקיר שאני עובד עליו. הדבר הזה לפני כמה שנים, לא הרבה, התחיל לעשות איזו מהפכה באנגליה, נייג'ל הוא מהאנשים שהובילו אותה שם, כמה בנאים שב-20 שנה האחרונות מערבבים תערובות חמות, כל אחד בנפרד, כנסו ביחד, הבינו שיש עוד אנשים שעושים את זה, הבינו שכולם מרגישים שזה הרבה יותר נכון ומתאים למבנים האלה, והדבר הזה התחיל שם איזושהי מהפכה, שיזמה גם הרבה יותר אנשים שהתחילים לעבוד עם זה, וגם הרבה מחקרים בנושא. זה איזשהו מחקר אחד שעשו על המאגר דגימות של הסקוטיש ליימסיידר, מאגר דגימות מאוד מאוד גדול, ועשו פילוח לפי החומר המקשר שיש כל הדגימות, לפי 100. זה לפני המאה ה-16, 16, 17, 18 וכן הלאה. הכחול זה תערובות שמבוססות על סיד חי. זה פשוט, כמו שאמרתי, זו הפעם הראשונה שאנחנו מרגישים שהחומר שאנחנו עובדים איתו באמת עונה על העיקרון הזה שאנחנו חוזרים עליו כל הזמן של דומה בדומה. שאנחנו מגיעים לחומר שהוא דומה לחומר המקורי, גם במראה, אבל הרבה יותר חשוב מזה בהתנהגות שלו ובתכונות שלו. רק בשביל להראות לכם שהדבר הזה כבר מתחיל לקרות בארץ, פה סרט של תמונות של פרויקטים שאנחנו עושים בשנה האחרונה. אז יש בית אבן בקיבוץ הרגבים, באר המטיליה בנחל גרר, תיקון אבן קטן בכנסיית המשיח, במגדל דוד קצת, רפת בעתלית, בית בכרם מהר"ל. זה כל פרויקטים שאנחנו עובדים בהם בתערובות חמות. חברת חשמל כמו דופר בתל אביב, פרויקט שאנחנו עכשיו בשלבי ההתחלה שלו, ניסיונות, דוגמאות, שילוב של כל הסיכוי אבן והבטון שהיה שם ב-30 שנה האחרונות. ופרויקט בשיתוף פעולה עם המעבדה האנליטית של רשות העתיקות, של אנליזה, שהמטרה שלה למחקר של החומרים מליטה במוצר עתלית, והתאמה של חומר לעבודות שימור שיקרו שם, לפי החומרים שיש. המטרה היא לא להגיע לחומר שהוא זהה, לאו דווקא בחומרים המקוריים, אבל שזאת תהיה נקודת הפתיחה. אני חושב שאם אנחנו שמים חומר שונה מהחומר שיש בתוך הטירות שאנחנו עובדים עליהם, אז צריכה להיות איזו סיבה מאוד טובה. ועוד אנשים שהתחילו לעשות את זה בארץ, אז יש תמונות שנתנאל שלח לי, וחלק פרויקטים שעשה פרויקט אחד ביחד עם איתן, פרויקט אחד ביחד עם רועי, שמבנים בשלם, שהתחילו לעבוד בהם בתערובות חמות. מילה אחת על בטיחות, לא היינו רוצים שכל מי שיצא מפה היום, ככה עוד לשים חי, ינסה מה שבא לו, בבית. העניין של הבטיחות הוא לא בשמיים, הוא לא קרוב לכל ההפחדות שאני בטוח שכולכם שמעתם, אבל יש עניין בטיחותי וצריך פשוט לדעת ולהבין מה עושים ואיך עושים את זה. נייג'ל, נגיע לנו היום, הוא בנאי אבן ב-30 שנה האחרונות, עובד עם תערובות חמות ב-20 שנה האחרונות, מהיוזמים מהמניעים של המהלך הזה שקיבל את השם באנגליה של מהפכת הסיד השנייה, שהתחיל ב7 שנים האחרונות. אתם עוד מעט תשמעו את כל מה שיש לו להגיד. מריה קלדרון שהגיעה איתו, היא עובדת בגנים הלאומיים של נורפיורק מורס, וגם יש לכם הרבה מה לדבר ולשמוע עובדת עם נייג'ל בשנים האחרונות בשיתוף פעולה באזור שהיא אחראית עליו, וגם באנגליה בכלל ובסקוטלנד החיה הולכת יותר ויותר לכיוון של המלצה על העבודה בתערובות חמות, שכיוון שהם הולכים אליו שתהיה להם תשתית מספיק טובה שיכולה באמת לייצר את הדבר הזה, זה חיוב של עבודה בתערובות חמות, תערובות עם סיד אווירי, איסור על עבודה עם סיד הידראולי.
Nearly 20 years, but for 18 years, and a few others around the UK were doing the same, and a few others in most countries, actually in Germany, Austria, there are people doing this. But about 6 years ago, we got together in Scotland, not knowing one another, masons, large stonemasons, plasterers, from around the UK and from Ireland. So it's always been a British and Irish thing. And we realised that there were more of us doing it than we thought, and that we all sincerely believed that this was the right thing and that what we were doing was, well, the wrong thing actually, I mean, not to mince words. And that just gave us the confidence, us getting together as a group, to start shouting about it really, and to start saying, well look, we think this is right, and we're all conservators, we all believe in like for like, but we've spent 40 years not working like for like, but pretending that we have been, and that caught fire really. We started organising big events where lots of us were talking and everyone was coming, and so it's been this very much a grassroots sort of upward pressure, but with a very positive response from Historic England, from Historic Scotland, the top level, the research level. So it's been this very much an alliance of grassroots craftspeople and the supervisory body, the research teams of Historic England and so on. So it's worked very well, but anyway, that's just a little introduction, and in the course of that, of course, when we started saying this is what we think should be done, obviously we hit a lot of resistance from people, from vested interest, vested intellectual interest, of course. And please understand, I'm not blaming or criticising anyone in anything I say. We have all done what we've done with the best of intention, and I have done the same. I have used all these materials myself, obviously I have, and always with the best of intention. So please, nobody take any, I'm not blaming anyone. This isn't a blame game, but we've got to get this right. We've got to reassess what we do and how we do it. And I believe that to be a benefit not only to ourselves as craftspeople and as conservators, but obviously to a benefit to our historic fabric. So yeah, just a little introduction. And this moves, does it? Which one?
The other side, this one.
Okay. Okay, so that's just a very brief introduction. This is, well, it's there because I love that little church. It's in Normandy, in the village of my former apprentice, who was French, Norman French. But earth line built, hot mix line pointed, the normal story. But that's just an introductory thing, so it's not. Thank you. Well, I'll take us to that now. Yep. Okay. If we can maybe just start with a basic principle, which I hope informs everything we're talking about. This is a Royal Institute of British Architects publication after the Second World War, very much aimed at building a better world after the horrors of the Second World War. But so it's a wonderful book to read because of its ethos, its attitude. But the technical evidence does not point to shortcuts in the achievement of good building. It points consistently to the discovery by scientific means of the rationale of established building traditions, which should be altered only with the full knowledge of the consequences. That's the key line, only in the full knowledge of the consequences. I don't want to talk much about natural hydraulic lines and that sort of thing at this moment, but I have to say we are using a material the consequences of which we do not know. The main outcome of the Historic England research, which should have been done 25 years ago into the properties of NHLs, the key headline is that they keep gaining strength. For a period we do not know. Nobody can tell us, no producer can tell us when they stop gaining strength, and they're gaining strength and lowering porosity in that whole process all of the time. So that's just one thing. And I in the course of all this research, I should just say, we've done a lot, people know, I've researched through hundreds and hundreds of old texts online, going back the last 2,000 years, from France, from Spain, from Britain, from, well, wherever I can understand and get the language. So what I'm saying is based on largely on that, and going through building accounts, so direct documents of real buildings historically where they're listing materials and so on and so forth. But anyway, I don't need to dwell on this, but this is what we're talking about: traditional building fabric that is capillary active in most of its forms. So that the materials we use need to be at least as capillary active as those materials to keep them dry. Not vapor permeable only, capillary active. This is the conflict we have in Britain at the moment. We've got many conservation products that are vapor open, capillary closed. If they are capillary closed, they will not work. Yeah? That's a difficult argument in the UK.
What do you mean by capillary, sorry, what do you mean by capillary closed?
Well, they put in ingredients that disrupt the pore structure so water will not move out by capillary action. Typically it will stay there.
What is vapor permeability?
Well, the movement, the idea that a water vapor molecule will pass through a porous material, which in and of itself defies the laws of physics. But yeah, and we've got all afternoon where we were demonstrating. I'm very happy to field any questions. Yeah, but so this is what we're talking about, not the resistance of the futile attempt to resist moisture, to manage moisture, but we need the right materials to do that. And our experience, as another example with NHLs, is most of the buildings that have been repointed or repaired with natural hydraulic lime in our part of in the north of England are permanently wet. Permanently wet. They're not drying. So anyway, that's a little bit about that. But in to summarize, if you like, the conclusions of all that research we've done, and all that research obviously in parallel with my experience, was critical, I think, that I actually use these mortars, not just reading a book, but relating everything I see. But all I can say in truth is that I've seen very little in 2,000 years that does not make sense to me. But when I hold that up to what we've said for the last 40 years, since the lime revival, most of that you don't find in books historically. It's a different story, it's a different narrative, it's an invented narrative that is not the same. And often the rules are not only different, they're the polar opposite for the last 2,000 years compared to the last 40 years. So this is quite an important thing. But this would be my summary of what were the traditional mortars in a general sense. So obviously earth mortars, very common over millennia. Clay-bearing subsoils, improved, and I still use that word, or otherwise, with well-tempered loam, improved with sand typically, in this case, to reduce the clay content, to reduce the shrinkage. Typically about 12% clay, a very high volume of silt, which I believe to be as important to the performance as the clay. Used for masonry construction, plastering, daubing, which is another word. Typically if you plastered with mud, it was called daubing in the UK. Floors, perhaps with additives, often with not. But more particularly, I would say, and a mortar that has been largely, certainly ignored by the conservation industry in the UK until recently, is an earth lime mortar that has a small, typically small, but not always a small, proportion of quicklime added to it, which transforms an earth mortar, which is not a bad mortar, but transforms it into a wonderfully workable, cohesive, adhesive, and much more water resistant mortar, but also very high in its capillarity, as a very optimal capillarity. And that's for the same purposes. And these mortars, most stone buildings in the United Kingdom built before 1800 were built with earth lime mortar. The bedding mortars are earth lime mortars. That is, in terms of historical time, there is no question the most common masonry mortar is earth lime mortar. It's not lime sand mortar, it's earth lime mortar. In terms obviously of volume, surviving volume, then we have a high volume of buildings built with lime sand mortar in the UK because they're newer. But if we mean in historical time, this is the key, and that is the typical Roman mortar of Roman construction and of Norman construction and all of these things. It is the most common mortar. But in most cases, I would say almost universally in the masonry trades, that you don't just leave that, although it is incredibly durable on its own. It's pointed with a very lime-rich mortar, and often a pure lime and hair mortar, or indeed a lime and limestone dust typically mortar, or a stone, but always with more lime than aggregate. So and so on, and so those are very common. Then we come into the hot mixed air air, understand the definition, an air lime, a fat lime, a pure lime, they're all the same thing. But the current European nomenclature is that we should use air. And of course, historically, natural hydraulic limes were called water limes. So air lime, water lime. It tells you where they belong. Fat limes in the air, water limes underwater or underground, where fat limes will not set. Simple as that. Because they rely on carbon dioxide, taking carbon dioxide. But anyway, so hot mix, and these displaced earth lime mortars for building in the UK after about 1800. Not sometimes after 1850. It varies around the country. And of course, then you've got a whole system that's built with hot mixed lime mortars, very lime rich, never leaner in use than 1 lime to 2 after slaking, never leaner. One of the biggest mistakes we made in the lime revival was to mix 1 slake lime to 3. That's a non-existent mortar historically. It does not exist. They are only ever, the leanest they are likely to be is 1 to 2. And they'll only be richer in lime than that, not leaner. And that is essential. It's why lime putty got a bad name in the UK and elsewhere. Not enough lime. And why we thought we knew better and thought, well, hey, let's ignore thousands of years of history and put half as much lime as they ever did into the mortar and then wonder why it doesn't quite work. That's modern arrogance, isn't it? We know better. We do not know better in the case of lime mortars. We really do not know better. So, and they are all universal. I mean, I would hazard that 95% of building mortars in the UK until around 1910 were made by this method, by a hot mix method, and from quicklime. So them, and then putty lime. Now, shock horror, this was a shock to me. Putty lime slaked with minimum volumes of water, so very differently slaked actually to the way it tends to be today. I think I would call modern putty lime yogurt. Lime yogurt. Maybe Greek yogurt to be fair, but that's about it. Lime putty, when described historically, is always described as being of a bread dough consistency. I think we can see that's a different material. And the difference comes from the method of slaking, as it does in all of these things. So, and that was used on its own as a mortar, not as a binder. Was distrusted through time as a binder. This is a shock. To me it was too. I didn't expect that. So until the 20th century, then it did become commonly used, but typically because they knew they were going to gauge it with Portland cement. And if you make a cement lime mortar with lime putty, it is beautifully workable. If you make it with hydrate, not nearly so workable. So, and it was used for the finest joints in stone ashlar, the finest brickwork joints, and for the finish coats on lime stucco. And that's what, when Vitruvius talks about laying lime down, it's to get rid of the lumps that haven't slaked, for them to slake. Because the purposes you're going to put it to demand that there are no lumps left, because you're going to use it for a fine finish. We're craftsmen. We don't want a lump scratching across the wall. It's as simple as that. There was no concept historically that it got better or matured. It was always to get rid of those lumps because of the purposes you were going to put it to, demanded no lumps left in the mortar. This is a hard thing to get across, or to absorb, that notion, but it is absolutely the case in my observation. And I think you've seen the graph just a minute ago of all the samples from Scotland and around. Where was the lime putty? That much, in those analyses. The hot mix, that much. So that's the difference. And then, so that's that point made. Okay. Lime and hair, but for common was roofing applications. But again, that was slaked and used immediately. In most cases, when they use lime putty, they would slake it and use it within a week, not 3 months. Their belief was the longer you laid lime putty down for, the weaker it became in its binding properties. And there is modern research that indicates that that is true. And you'll see that with the hot mixes. The bond within the mortar is completely different. It's a very tenacious bond within the mortar as you're using it, as you're making it. Very different. So it's not a bad material. I mean, if people want to carry on using lime putty on the historic monuments, great. It's a very sacrificial material, but I think in masonry terms and craft terms, maybe a little too sacrificial, perhaps, you know. It lets more water in, particularly when it's too lean in lime. And then we've got hot mixed or sand slate, moderately or eminently hydraulic lime mortars. And I would say right now that a modern NHL2 is not a feebly hydraulic lime. By historic definitions, by VCAS definitions, he would have called a currently available natural hydraulic lime to an eminently hydraulic lime, okay? Where that leaves NHL5, I don't know. But as you will see later today, in many of the brands, the NHL2s are the strongest, not the 5s. This is one of the problems. You don't know what you've got in that bag. But they were used underwater. Our blue lias, which was considered the hardest natural hydraulic lime available for engineering works, that was 72% free lime. There is no NHL on the... No, it's a geology.
Oh, it's not the brand?
No, it's a geology, yeah. And if they might use them underwater, but if they did, they would add pozzolans into that to consume the free lime. They didn't trust them on their own as an underwater mortar, but more likely they were used in very wet conditions underground, and that sort of thing. But I have to say, the evidence of all my research is that the only purpose for which natural hydraulic lime was the preferred binder in the UK, in Europe generally, was to make concrete. That was the only purpose that they preferred to use it for. So for those conservators, and I'm one of them in the room, we have to ask a simple question. Why have we spent the last 25 years covering our buildings with a material that historically, and still at the end of the 19th century, they considered to be only appropriate to make concrete floors and concrete footings of buildings and rammed béton in France, rammed concrete structures, yeah? I'd leave that question in the air, all right? So, and then natural cement after 1796, but that again wasn't used for building. That would be, no mason would use that to build a structure with. That's far too hard, far too fast setting, but it was useful for waterworks because it does set underwater very quickly, and mainly for cast mouldings. American engineers liked it for fortifications, but they were building these during the Civil War. They needed them built and strong from the moment they were built. They didn't have time to wait. But even then, they used hot mix mortars, generally lime rich, and they would gauge with natural cement to speed that initial set, yeah? Never use it on its own for that purpose. But they would often point with it on its own. And we are in the period where I believe we do need to consider cement lime mortars to be historic mortars, and that where they exist and where they're causing no damage, which they will rarely do, in my observation, a 129 or a 1312, 116 is a different matter, perhaps. We need to be working like for like with these materials. So in Tel Aviv, we've got very successful cement lime mortar work that is being displaced by other mortars. Why? The like-for-like material is cement lime. And a typical cement lime, or a 129, has 66% of its binder is air lime. There is no natural hydraulic lime on the market that has that much free lime in it. And the other thing to say, as I will demonstrate later, the key issue with natural hydraulic limes, one of the key reasons they were never used for building unless they had no choice historically, is that they are an inherently variable material, not only between sources, but within the same quarry. They vary in strength all of the time from one day to the next. Portland cement, which is mineralogically, I mean, put it another way, a natural hydraulic lime is actually a weak cement lime mortar. That's what it is. It should be, in my opinion, be called a natural cement lime mortar, not a natural hydraulic lime mortar. But they are predictable. We know exactly what the strengths will be. We also know that a typical cement lime mortar will reach maximum strength after 3 months. Not after 10 or 20 or 30 years. We know pretty certainly that NHLs will gain strength for 10 years at least after they've been in a wall, and on it goes. We don't know. That's the whole point. We don't know. Isn't the basic rule of conservation, we don't use materials that we don't know the potential of, the consequence of. So we need to take these seriously. They are well-performing mortars, and they were designed to be exactly that, initially by the United States Bureau of Standards, who recognized the need for high free lime, as high a free lime content as you could get, but compromising with modern building technology and the demands of the modern building industry that did demand rapid early initial set. That's all it's about. They're often weaker than if you used a straight pure lime mortar. 1-3-12 is unquestionably weaker than a 1-3 hot mix lime mortar with no hydraulic activity at all. But of course, the hot mix will take more years to get to that strength. That's the difference. So, okay, I want to initially go through, forget all that, this versus that. What we actually need to look at is what actually are mortars for. You know, what does a mortar need to be to do the job that is asked of it? And so to look at historic understanding of that, so this, the first one, mortar ought to serve at least 3 purposes: to form a soft but gradually hardening bed, critical, soft but gradually hardening bed, to receive the various building materials, so that these shall obtain a uniform bearing, notwithstanding the irregularity of their surfaces. We would add to that now, a soft but gradually hardening bed is essential to the formation of the bond with the substrate. You need that to be, but I'll talk about that in a minute. In the second place, to prevent the passage of wind and rain through the joint. And even the United States Bureau of Standards, you know, you might think we're all cement lovers, always acknowledge that the mortar that will keep the building driest, that will resist the most mortar penetration, rain penetration, is a pure lime mortar. That is the one, because it makes a proper durable bond that prevents the water getting in. But we'll talk about that later. And that the more hydraulic that mortar is, the less it will resist the penetration of water. Counterintuitive, but that's all to do with bond and the quality of the bond that is made. And lastly, to have adhesive and cohesive strength enough to bind the component parts of the wall into one solid mass. Not, as some engineers frustratingly say, even friends of mine, engineers who are friends of mine, the purpose of mortar is not to hold the stones apart, as they so often, it's to glue them together. I'm a stonemason. Why would you, if you don't want, you can build the wall dry, it can still be structural, but it won't resist the things we want to. So it is to hold them together, it's not to hold them apart. That gives quite a misleading impression of what mortars are for. And then if we move to 1964, Robert Boynton, American chemist, any work by his is fantastic, but mortar strength is often greatly overemphasized to the detriment of other essential mortar properties, such as workability, water retentivity, and bond strength. He doesn't mean strong bond strength, he means appropriate and full extent of bond. And those builders who strive for high or maximum mortar strengths usually obtain inferior mortar for normal above grade construction. Again, we're talking largely here about above ground construction. And you know, in the UK by the 1920s, it was asserted that you could not build a building with fat lime mortars, ignoring the fact we've been doing that for 2,000 years at least. But you couldn't do that, you had to have cement in there. That was a propaganda, that was ideology, it was all sorts of things. But again, the US Bureau of Standards were unusual in that as long as the wall was this thick, they were quite happy for a wall to be built with a pure lime mortar, no hydraulicity at all. And this wall we rebuilt with just a 1-3 hot mix, no pozzolans. The only thing that stopped me building that wall was the time I had to build it. Because to build with hot mix mortars, they receive the stone, they stiffen to a load bearing immediately, really, and you can just keep building. You shouldn't go too high in one go, obviously, for structural reasons, but you could, if you really wanted, you could build the whole thing in a day with hot mixes if you had the people to do it. That is a huge quality in a building mortar. So this is dry. There's a bit of green there, but that's because we'd just taken away the scaffold that had been there all winter. The scaffold was hay bales, a big, great, and so it had been holding moisture obviously against that wall, but it's very dry now. But okay, more surprisingly perhaps, this is the modern ASTMS international standard for mortars. The workability is the most important property of plastic mortar. Workable mortars can be spread easily with a trowel into the separations, etc. of the masonry unit. Workable mortar also supports the weight of the masonry units when placed and facilitates alignment, pretty much what the other guys just said and maybe what I've just said. It adheres to vertical masonry surfaces. You know, you bust a perp joint, the mortar actually stays there. What a revelation, you know, instead of just falling straight off again, yeah? So you can press your next stone into that mortar, not try and retrospectively, well, people don't. If it won't stay there, most masons, they sod that, yeah? The point that the Reba make at in that book as well, you can give the best masons in the world the wrong materials and you will get bad work. It's the materials that drive that and the potential of those materials that drive the workmanship. Because, anyway, we'll talk about that later. So, workability is a combination of several properties: plasticity, consistency, cohesion and adhesion, and I underline that because I'm like that, which have defied exact laboratory measurement. And that's what I want to say in general. Most laboratory tests for the materials we use are meaningless to us as users and to the buildings we use them on. Freeze-thaw tests. Again, the US Bureau of Standards said in 1920s, that test is absolutely meaningless. Yeah? Doesn't tell us anything, actually, about what we need to know. And it's the same with many, many laboratory tests. They're in a bubble that they can talk to one another from one lab to the next, but they're not telling us anything that we need to know. And beware of this. It's very, very common. And of course, I like this line, but the mason can best assess workability by observing the response of the mortar to the trowel. Good workability is essential for maximum bond with the masonry units. I think there are a lot of professionals obviously don't understand that workability is critical to everything. They think it's something nice. And of course we've got lots of conservation firms in the UK, the masons and others of which have never used anything other than natural hydraulic lime. So they don't even know what workability is because they are not workable mortars, yeah, in my opinion. They feel like sand and water on my trowel, yeah? That's not a workable mortar. So,
I feel like cement.
the same, and well, I'm coming to why that is, but so a wall containing, this is again the ASTMS, modern, a straight Portland cement sand mortar would be strong but vulnerable to cracking and rain penetration. A wall containing a straight sand lime mortar would have lower strength, particularly earlier strength, but greater resistance to cracking and rain penetration. Now, this is the modern American standard. You know, here we are over in Europe and the Middle East, we somehow think we know more than the Americans. I'm telling you now, in terms of standards and mortars, the Americans know far more than any of us, in truth, their essential nature. And that is the legacy of the United States Bureau of Standards research done back in the 1920s and 30s that's still running through the buildings industry in the USA. I'm not saying they do this, I'm saying they understand the importance of it. Now, why is workability important? It's not just something nice to have, because workability indicates the key property of water retentivity, which is the resistance of the mortar to letting its water go straight away into the substrate or into the air. And if you don't have water retentivity, that happens. We know, NHL mortars, they dry very fast. In doing that, they tend not to have made a bond because the water, and they are hydraulic, so their set relies on water. You put a porous brick to a non-retentive mortar, it will suck the water out of the junction straight away, and that mortar at that junction will not set properly, ever. And it will leave a capillary pathway for water to run through. the other thing is, if they're not water retentive, cement will make a strong bond, but only here and there. It leaves gaps. It doesn't make a bond everywhere. The US Bureau of Standards went through this ad infinitum in the 20s and 30s because they were trying to understand why their brick buildings of solid wall construction in America were leaking like sieves for the first time in history, having just been built with cement sand mortars. Yeah? The absence of workability affects workmanship. The absence of water retentivity prevents their ability to make a proper bond and a full extent of bond. A water retentive mortar does make that bond because it's slowly letting that water out, and suction, again, with 25 years of natural hydraulic lime use, we kind of see suction from the fabric as our enemy. It's actually our friend. It's what helps our mortars to set and to stiffen to the degree when carbonation can begin. Carbonation begins when the water content of a mortar is only 5%. But you don't want it to get there too fast. It needs to be a steady release and in equilibrium with the porous substrate. And that's what you get when you use a water retentive mortar. And that was the purpose of the US Bureau of Standards saying 1-3-12. It gave you workability in that mortar and water retentivity in that mortar. Therefore, the bond was right. Yeah. So if we look at and what they talk about, this is a cement sand repair in Canada that I undid last year, and everyone was saying to me, well, yeah, but we don't want to take that down because we haven't got any more of these tiles. They came from San Francisco in 1860. We can't, and if you take it down because it's built with cement, you'll lose them all. I lost none because not a single clay tile had made a bond with the cement. It was difficult because it's hard. You know, you've got to be careful, but actually you just lift them out and you have what the US Bureau of Standards call mortar pancake. There's a mortar pancake. That's exactly what we're talking about. The absence of water, the water is sucked out of that junction, doesn't set properly, doesn't make a bond, therefore it's always going to let water in. And to the lesser extent, but to a relative extent, NHLs are exactly the same. Okay? And I did do it, I rebuilt it with a hot mix there, and so on. And the other thing that they talk about and that Boynton talks about is the durability of the bond. Not that the bond is durable in frost and all that, but that once that bond is made, it doesn't break, that it stays there. And this is a cavity wall construction, 1950s in the UK, so 1950s, hear that date. There is a hot mix airline mortar that it was built with. It's in perfect order. That recession is not erosion. That's how that was the style by the 1950s. Leave the mortar back a bit. And that bond is fully intact. And that building is dry. This one next door, built with the same materials but repointed with cement, is permanently wet. This one is permanently dry, and that's the difference. Yeah. So another reason that even if they haven't made a proper bond, a mortar without water retentivity will break its bond because if it's hydraulic, because of the inevitable, the nature of hydraulic materials. Every time a cement or a highly hydraulic material gets wet, it expands a little bit and then it shrinks. It expands and it shrinks, and it does that in every rain cycle. It also does similar in every thermal cycle. So those two things, they're unstable materials. So even if they've made a bond in the first place, they're going to break that bond. We get initial shrinkage in fat lime mortars. Some people find that irritating. But again, the US Bureau of Standards, bless their souls, looked at that too and showed that that initial shrinkage that we get in a fat lime mortar, whether that's lime putty, hydrated lime or a hot mix lime, is in the first 24 hours when the mortar is still plastic because it's water retentive. And that, once you close that down, as you do and you can, that's the only shrinkage that mortar will ever experience in its life. And typically it doesn't shrink, that doesn't move forward. It's a lateral shrinkage pattern. With hydraulic materials, and of course relative to their hydraulicity, they demonstrated, and we know this, we all know this, we see cement renders full of cracks. Yeah, that's not because of mechanical movement, that's because of the nature of the material. They will shrink up to 4 times that same volume that we get in a fat lime mortar in their lifetimes, but only after they have set hard, when there's nothing you can do about it. So I said earlier, I just want to say, well, these are what we do with these mortars, these are what they're for, which mortars actually meet those criteria. And I have to say, in summary, I'm not sure I've finished yet, but in summary, earth lime mortars and hot mix lime mortars and fat lime lime-rich mortars. Doesn't have to be a hot mix. That's not essential. That's just the most efficient, economic way of making the best mortar in the world. That's all. So I'm not biased, but they don't have to be. So that's where we need to hold these mortars up to these criteria, because the purpose is surely that the building doesn't crack and that it is dry most of the time. That's what they are supposed to be, isn't it? We've forgotten what they look like in Britain, and just an extreme example of that, this is the Atlas fountain at Castle Howard. Obviously we didn't use hot mix airlines when we repaired this building, obviously we didn't, but in 1982 they filled this is on the elbow of this Triton here, they filled that with a neat cement. Logical, it's a fountain, you have to use neat cement, and the expansion and contraction of that in what we can't deny is a very wet environment, that expansion and contraction, this is Portland stone. Look at these, it's as if you chop away from that joint with an axe. It's not, it's expansion and contraction in wetting and drying cycles. It has incrementally just split that stone away either side of itself. That's what we're talking about, this expansion, contraction in wetting and drying cycles. Sorry, oh, wrong, what's happening? There's a blue thing on there. I did use a hot mix airline to repair the end of his nose, that was missing. So that's still there, even though it's just an airline hot mix. Oh, he's gone now. He's offended. Sorry? Right, okay, sorry, yeah. Okay, and if we start to look at this shrinkage in the context of natural hydraulic lime, this is Holy Island, Lindisfarne, the church on Holy Island, so a very important church, one might think. Repointed with a natural hydraulic, I know exactly which one and I know exactly when, with Astier 3.5, the softer of the NHLs on the market, it has to be said, and probably the more consistent, not always, but I hate to say it because they're the most aggressive marketers of this material in the world, but and this was done in 1999, so this is it. We're looking at something done when I looked at this 20 years before, and I think you can see that has shrunk away from every stone. So it didn't make a bond in the first place, and then its natural behavior has led to shrinkage away, and the inside of that wall, which is that thick, is bright green with algae. So that's not that's not what we want, is it? We don't want that. And of course, in situations where there are salts in the equation at lower level, the softer of the Pennine sandstone, because this stone is one of the most durable in the world, you would say, is powdering away with salt activity, and the mortars are not behaving in any way sacrificially. Okay, they can't. So that's after repointing with and this is another dilemma we have. That mortar that's there in no way resembled in colour or anything else mortar proportion the original mortars of that wall. This does, and the bloody architect's complaining about it, saying, "Oh well, couldn't you have matched the cement mortars in cut?" No, I couldn't. I did it like for like, Why didn't you walk around the island and see these mortars all over the island still there before you decided they weren't durable? Anyway, so, and that, I hope you'll agree, that's very dry now, and that's what we expect to see when we point with hot mixes. And I'm coming into the reason why. So, when hot mix lime mortars, lime-rich fat lime mortars, don't have to be hot mix, but with at least 1 to 2 proportion, are very capillary active. And that is the key to this behaviour. Any water getting into their pore system is going to come out. Now the fact that they're capillary active, which is the sales pitch of most NHL suppliers and producers in the UK, is, oh, they're capillary active, so when the rain hits them, they're just going to soak water right in, like they do if you put them in a dish of water, but there's not many buildings that sit in dishes of water, it has to be said. They'll say that, but actually again, because what you get in a calcium carbonate matrix is a very particular pore structure, a very particular pore size distribution, very dominated by 1 micron pores, so 1,000th of a millimeter, but those sorts of either side of that are the optimal for capillary movement. Any water that gets into those doesn't want to be there. I'm going to get out of here, and the wind drives that process. Yeah, the energy from the wind is driving the capillarity, but it's essential that you have an interconnected pore structure, obviously, which high lime rich mortars do have, and they have this, as I say, this preponderance, I'll show you the graph in a minute, of 1 micron pores there or thereabouts. And so they're actively sucking water out of the fabric. And of course that's the job of the mortar. Unless you have a render, a plaster, the mortar has to do that work, and it needs to do it in preference to the stone having to do it. Typically a more, sandstone has a bigger pore structure, it's not as capillary active. So limestone, of course, has exactly the same pore size distribution and structure. So the worst thing you can do is to point any limestone building with a mortar that is of lesser capillarity. Capillarity is the real meaning of compatibility. It's not about compressive strength, that's shorthand. And obviously the more compressive, usually the denser and the less capillary active, but not actually necessarily in the case of a high, anyway, sorry, I won't go there. This is David Wiggins, the engineer who's one of our gang. But if you plug that, what we need to happen is any water hitting that building, and I'm sorry, I didn't finish, the thing about capillarity, the air pressure within that pore structure will resist the penetration of water beyond about that limit. So in a capillary active mortar, received water cannot get very far. And all of us who work on building, we know this to be true. We might not have taken it on board, but we know this to be true. We spray the old mortar joints for, if it's NHL, well, for as long as you possibly can to give yourself some kind of insurance against it drying too fast. And if we dug in with a mortar pick, we'd see that the water has gone that far. We could have stood there with a hose pipe for an hour. It's still only gone that far because the air pressure within resists. And this is physics. It's not theory, not an opinion. These are the fundamental laws of physics. So that we're seeing in operation, yeah? And so, but water going in here, but water is received in other ways, obviously. And if it's in the wall, it needs to be got out as quickly as possible. So with a bigger pore size distribution, it's going to want to go into the most capillary mortar part, and that is the mortar, and that's the definition of sacrificiality, that any salts or whatever are captured in the face of this mortar. But it needs to be capillary active for that to happen. It's not enough to put something in and say, oh, we'll resist the salts. They're still there, and they're going to come out through the stone if they can't come through the mortar. So that's we all know this, don't we? But sadly, the materials they're using don't kind of know it sometimes. So this is the thing. So this is a graph of the pore size distribution in a historic hot mixed lime mortar. Very high domination by 1 micron pores on either side. This is an NHL 3.5 pore size distribution. Here are the 1 micron pores. I'm just going to ask you to compare the relative volume of those capillary active pores in that mortar. And of course, St. Astier used to, I don't think they do anymore, funnily enough, but they used to have on their adverts low free lime, low capillarity, as if that was a selling point. That was a good thing. It's a really bad thing, but they're not wrong. And theirs is, as I say, the softest on the market, actually. So this does get worse, so prepare yourselves. If we then look at the pore size distribution and the porosities of an NHL 3.5 and a masonry cement, Portland cement mortar, as I once did, and I still think I was wrong. I was in an audience of 250 people, the main NHL seller from Portugal, and I asked him to explain, given that those look very similar, why they behave so differently in his opinion. You know, but this is the point. They are almost the same in their porosity, but it's not the right kind of porosity. And in their pore size distribution, they are virtually identical. And you know, after 20 years of using NHL in a wet climate in the UK, I can tell you they behave exactly the same as a cement mortar, not as a cement lime mortar, as a cement mortar. So, and again, in pursuit of workability, it's very common in the UK to add air entrainment. Yeah, air entrainment. Do you understand that term? And as this graph shows, here we've got capillarity and vapor permeability, which is something to be demonstrated in the lab only, but has been used.
Chemical additive?
Yes, it was soap, basically. Builders used to use washing up liquid, because it creates big bubbles, yeah? Which they say makes it frost resistant, because the expansion of an ice crystal is smaller than the trouble is, water loves to sit in big bubbles, in big pores. It'll put its feet up and, you know, read the newspaper. It doesn't want to get out, whereas it wants to get out of a very small, yeah. So, and this is just showing what happens when you add air entrainment. It increases vapor permeability in a laboratory. I mean, the test is entirely false. They suck or force air through a porous material. And usually with a vacuum on one side. Well, we don't live in vacuum, okay? And then they say it's breathable. No, because vapor cannot move of its own volition through a porous material. So, and that's the capillarity, that's the vapor permeability. I should say, if it is about vapor permeability, which it isn't, a typical hot mix has twice the vapor permeability of any other mortar in the world, okay? So if that's all it was about, they're twice as breathable. But so we've increased the vapor permeability, which means nothing, won't work, won't dry the building, and we have all but eliminated capillarity. So that is a major problem, and most masons in the UK put air entrainment into NHL mortars, not for frost resistance, to try and get at least some workability in that bloody material, yeah? I don't know a builder, an ordinary builder anyway, who does not hate natural hydraulic lime. It seems in Britain the only people who love it are the conservators. Ordinary builders despise the material, not because it's lime, because they recognise all its problems. That's why they did, to mitigate. And they are much more breathable and much more capillary active, because all of this workability, real breathability, as in capillarity, all comes from the free lime in that mortar. That's where it is. It's not in the sands, it's not in the, as some engineers say, vapor permeability is in the sand, but it doesn't work. It's the lime that gives the properties that we need, and the more of it you can get, the better, yeah?
Because of the pore size?
That's they didn't know that, the US Bureau Standard, but that makes the better bond and everything else. So let's just have a look at a few examples. This, grade 1 listed, very important building, pointed 3 years ago with natural hydraulic lime, soaking wet all of the time. This humble little building, pointed by a local builder who's never used lime before in his life, but likes to use hot mixes, as is our experience. Ordinary builders love hot mixes once they've discovered them, and once they trust that they will be durable. That's all they need to know. And I have to tell you, the geology of the stone is the same, all right? So you wouldn't guess that, would you, from the colour of those buildings? So one is very wet, one is very dry. Other examples, though, this is cement, and this is obviously the typical pattern, climbing up to here. That's NHL. That shouldn't be happening really, should it?
But a bit more.
That's a hot mix building, hot mix pointed building. So again, humble, a dry one, and that one a wet one, that one a wet one. And this is what we see. And all that happens in the winter is these moisture levels will go higher, typically. You know, they don't go away ever, but they might go higher. Another little build. This is again a building just done in Helmsley, where Maria lives. Done with hot mixes by ordinary builders, because Maria makes them. You know, the park will not allow the use of NHLs. They insist on like for like, and that always means either earth lime or hot mix lime, or the two in combination. Except we drive down every time, we keep looking at this pediment and thinking, everywhere else is dry as a bone, the pediment is wet. I'm certain that they lost their nerve and bought into the idea that you needed to use NHL up there because that was more exposed. We haven't got an answer out of them. Maria keeps asking. I don't need an answer. I'm pretty certain that's what's happened. So it's nice to see the two mortars done at the same time. And this is less than a year ago that this was finished. So it doesn't take long for this moisture to start to accumulate in the fabric of these other buildings. Another one, I mean, this is a typical thing. This was done by another builder. I specified and oversaw the work and just trained them up insofar as they needed it. And they did all this work. It was done through the winter. We had bleed out from, the only place we used natural hydraulic lime was in the ridge. And of course we're losing a lot of the free lime there is because it's bleeding out, which is the typical pattern. The hydraulic set interferes with the carbonation set. There's no question, and so it delays it. But, and so that's that. And these buildings had never been repointed with cement. They're earth lime built. I didn't perceive them to be especially wet myself, you know. That part of the range a year later, I mean, they were wet. And that again is illustrating the dynamic nature. They didn't have Portland cement, but there wasn't lime pointing at the face. And that you need it at the face so the wind can activate the capillarity. So it's a dynamic system. This isn't a passive system. This is a dynamic system when you use these lime-rich mortars. And another example with NHL, 4 years ago when I did all these photos, this building is wet all the way up. And I think the guy who was mixing it just forgot to put the air entrainment in, perhaps, is all I can say. And again, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? I did several things. I chopped out the NHL in that zone. This was taken the next day. So the day after I'd released the capillary active mortars again, that they could get to work, those bricks dried overnight. I did a panel here across the capillary rise, so I couldn't be accused of cheating. And again, when I went in the next morning to dress that mortar back, the bricks in that zone were dry. So this is a shocking thing in a way, and the same there. And you can see here, it's not only the bricks that are wet, the mortar is wet all of the time. It can't get rid of its water because it does not have an interconnected pore size and the right pore size distribution. And just to show you the longer term consequences of this was St. Astier 3.5 used in 1999 to point a Pennine sandstone, as I say, one of the most durable sandstones in Britain. This does not decay normally. And we have no sacrificial behaviour in that mortar, and this incredibly durable stone is having to behave sacrificially and deal with the salts, and the salts are breaking it down. We'd expect that when we use cement. That's in Moulton. This is where I live, around there. The only part of Britain where we have a calcareous sandstone. And this is in Acco, pointed with NHL. We understand, or premixes. The biggest problem with a lot of premixes is that they have air entrainment added. There's nothing you can do about it. They add it in there, and water repellent usually. Both of those things will destroy capillary activity. It eliminates it. So you might as well be pointing with plastic, is the truth of the matter. Except plastic wouldn't make a great bond. But anyway. So this is what we expect. Salt degradation. This is sacrificial behavior in the calcareous sandstone as a result of pointing with an inappropriate. I'm not here to condemn, but I am. Of course I am. Why do I pretend, you know? But I hope it's based on evidence, yeah? And observation and experience. But that's just a little local example. Right, okay, so let's start looking at actually the mortars they were used. There's Batty Langley, London, 1750. There are several kinds of mortar used, or the mortars used in buildings are 8. Not any, so inside and outside mortar made of lime and sand. Now that's the general mortar. That's for most things. Terrace mortar, which means trass mortar, they spell it all sorts of ways. Trass is a volcanic ash from Germany that is the most commonly used for hundreds and hundreds of years in Britain and in Holland and everywhere else for underwater works, yeah, for waterworks. Brick dust mortar, again a pozzolanic mortar. Bastard terrace made of blacksmith's forge ashes. You know, you've got iron, you've got fuel ash. These are all things that will give pozzolanic reaction, yeah. Pargeting mortar made of lime and horse dung. And horse dung was used largely because it's full of fibre. Yeah, that's, so it resists shrinkage and so on. But this is inside chimneys, where lime plastering inside a chimney is not going to do very well because of all the pollution and so on. Furnace mortar for furnaces, ovens, kilns, so anywhere where there's real fire. Windsor loam. Windsor is around London. Loam, clay-bearing subsoil, yeah? That's what it means. And so, and then plaster mortar made of calcined alabaster. And of course, historic gypsums are not always the same as what we use today. There were many variations, but nonetheless, that isn't for building, it isn't for plastering. In this context, this is a bricklaying book. It's for gluing decorative tiles on fireplaces. That's what the gypsum is used for, as a glue.
Interior use.
Sorry?
Interior use.
Yes, interior, yeah. And then fine mortar, so reiterating what I said at the beginning, for those that maybe didn't believe me, fine mortar, called putty, for rubbed and gauged works. That's the red rubbing bricks, the really tight jointed brickwork. Made of lime only, used on its own as a mortar, yeah? No sand, just as it is. And then if we look at the composition of these mortars, so inside mortar, 1 load of sand, 1,500 of lime. They like to mix their measures, and of course we don't fully understand, makes it difficult to compare, but anyway, mix up together as the lime is slaked in small quantities. That's a clear description of hot mixing. Outside mortar, the difference is not in the lime, not in any pozzolanic addition, it is simply in the quality of the sand. The sharpest, cleanest sand. The inside might have clay in it and so on, and they didn't care because it's inside. So 2 heaped bushels of unslaked lime, so quick lime, to 1 of sand. So the quick lime, as I assume you know, doubles in volume as you slake it. So that mortar will be 4 parts of lime to 1 part of sand. Yeah, this is London in 1750. Yeah, and of course these very lime-rich mortars are all around us in this part of the world as well, with hardly any sand, and they're all around me in my village, and it's very much the norm. Trass mortar, chiefly used in walls exposed to water, rivers, ponds, cisterns, toilets, cold baths, etc. 2 bushels of hot lime to 1, so 2 lime, hot lime in that case, so it's just been slaked and then you mix it in. So it is actually a 2 to 1 proportion, in fact, not the other way. And then similarly brick dust the same and so on. These are all for underwater or underground use. And you will note, not a single mention of natural hydraulic lime, yeah? These are pozzolanic mortars made by hot mix method. And that's I suppose, the moment to say. We are talking about a method,
But when was it
not a single material. A method by which we can make any kind of material.
When was it invented? Around
What?
this time, no? The
How
natural
far back
hydraulic
you can
method.
go
With
with the idea?
the hot mixing,
Yeah.
well, the very earliest lime mortars known to us from the Neolithic period, it was for floors, hot mixed. And I would say ever since.
No, I was asking
Based
when
on
was the natural hydraulic lime?
Oh, well, it was known about then. Oh, no, it was. But you're not wrong. John Smeaton, the engineer, is the first one who recognised what it was. I think they just previously thought it was a really tough lime.
That's what,
Yeah.
around 1700 something.
In 1756, he did that. And it did start to get used more for water work then, but not as much as we think. And if it was used, always with pozzolanic addition, never on its own.
This is pre-invention.
Yeah, I'm coming on to that, but you will see that nonetheless, they preferred to use a hot mix pozzolanic hydraulic lime. It's more workable. The point, I would say very quickly, you can make the most hydraulic mortar you need, you know, it will set hard underwater, but with the extra lime, it is as workable as a hot mix. It is as water retentive in its early phases as a hot mix, so it makes a proper bond, and it's really workable for the craftsman or woman increasingly.
How does it dry
So,
enough to-
sorry?
How does it dry enough to carbonate? It's in the waterworks and stuff.
It doesn't need to. No, an underwater mix. There is no free lime left.
Oh, so it's all
Carbonation is, that's the point, you're consuming the free lime. It's irrelevant underwater. So that's why they're adding, with our Blue Lias hydraulic lime, which had a lot of free lime, they're putting pozzolan in to consume that free lime, because it's not necessary. But it's still workable in the meantime, yeah? That's, I keep coming back to that. Workability and the initial water retentivity is essential to the formation of a proper bond that will last, yeah? So, now, just a few, and should we have a little break in a little while? Just a quick coffee break. Not like yesterday. Don't sort of everyone go out and start, and then what? Take half an hour, was it, or something? You know, because we. But anyway, we've got more time today. It's all right. But just a few to set the tone. So that's a British description of mortars. This is France. You know, if you believe, say, Assier's marketing. France, the place where they have only ever used natural hydraulic lime to do everything. Completely untrue, as I will show you. But anyway, Hassenfratz, a French engineer, 1825. I should say my apprentice Emma, and I want to acknowledge the fact, was from France. But she, in the course of this, she translated many French texts into English that have never been in English. So, you know, that's her contribution to this. And in fact, many of the French texts are the most enlightening. In truth, they went into far more detail about things very often. So, in the ordinary constructions, we prefer to employ fat limes and sand to gather stones and to build walls, because this mortar is abundant and cheaper, and it takes the most sand. We'll talk about that. The most sand is 3 parts to 1 quicklime, but that's what they considered a high sand carrying capacity. NHLs and so were mixed at 1 to 1 or 1 to 2, never, you know. So anyway, because in humid places, in particular underwater, wherever we wish to stop the action and infiltration of water, we use a mortar that hardens underwater, or we use some béton. And natural hydraulic lime is typically the binder in what the French call béton, but it's concrete. That's what it meant. Well, you use the term here, don't you? I heard somebody say it. Yeah. Bloody French, they get everywhere, don't they? But anyway, so we differentiate mortars thus. Fat lime, this is, but Chrysally, 1910, not a long time ago, Champly. We differentiate mortars thus. Fat lime, used for raising walls, so above ground construction. Hydraulic lime, not necessarily naturally hydraulic, but hydraulic lime for foundations, substructures, basements, and works meant to be immersed, you know, under the ground or under the water. Slow or prompt cement for underwater works or in very humid places. Now, the distinction he's making here is calling Portland cement slow as opposed to natural cement, which, as we know, sets hard in about 15 minutes. Nightmare to work with in many ways, yeah? You can add quicklime to slow that down. Don't need to add citric acid, add quicklime. That'll give you more working time and more workability. But anyway, so those two quotes to me are the hierarchy of traditional building construction for most of history, and we're still obviously working then. And I said yesterday, and maybe this might be a place to pause. I'll pause there, but I fundamentally believe that traditional building technology, everything porous and capillary active, unless the stone itself is really hard and not porous, but of course the core of the wall, the mortars are, that this is the best system of building ever invented. Yeah, I mean, and the full system, where we've got plasters of the same kind inside and a render, an exterior plaster of the same material, and a lime wash, that is the full system. And it's a brilliant system. It keeps buildings dry, that is thermally efficient, far more than we pretend. But of course, once that fabric gets wet, it starts to suffer problems, you know, and it becomes thermally inefficient. It becomes all these things. So I fundamentally believe, and of course these are sustainable. That's a sustainable architecture. It's a vernacular locally most of the time. Anyway, again from France, and Emma, who's only ever known hot mixes, of course, and she is from Calvados, when she translated this, I got "Wahey" in capital letters after, as she's translating it, because you see. But anyway, sometimes, I'd say every time, the more, this is an engineer, because engineers are campaigning for the use of hydraulic limes from VCAT onwards, you know, for other uses, not just for underground. The crafts are resisting that campaign. That's the point. They're refusing. And this sums that up. Half the lime kilns in the region of Calvados produce natural hydraulic lime, but it just gets spread on the farmers' fields to improve the fields. Whereas the same lime is not at all used by the masons, because it does not expand as much when it slakes. That's one thing. And because it hardens quickly. Therefore, the workers would have to change how they work. It's the mirror of what the battle we have today. People are used to fast setting materials. You need to change the way you work, and you can understand the resistance. But and then just a few to demonstrate that, because this narrative in the UK is very strong, the idea that we always used natural hydraulic limes in the past. The evidence is that we did not, and in fact that we actively did not. So when you give water to a hydraulic quicklime, it might take 12 hours for it to generate any heat and to slake. So when we see this, lime which slakes the quickest and heats the most in slaking is best, this also falls into the finest powder. The finest particle size, the greatest surface area, the maximum bonding potential with the aggregates, because of that surface area. Let stone lime, by which they mean lime made from stone, not because it's hydraulic, be chosen, which heats the most in slaking, slakes the quickest when duly watered, that which is the freshest made and the closest kept, that which dissolves in distilled vinegar, so when you put acid to it, with the least effort and leaves the smallest residue insoluble. If it's hydraulic, it would leave obviously a lot of residue. So these are descriptions of pure lime. And the idea that they didn't want it, and I'll just end on this and we'll have a break. John Smeaton, brilliant. Read his book if you can get it. The Narrative of the Eddystone Lighthouse, one of the best books about lime ever written. I mean, he was something of a hero of mine. He's been quoted against himself here. But Smeaton is saying it is not to be wondered that workmen generally prefer the more pure limes for building in the air, because being unmixed with any uncalcareous matter, they fall into the finest powder, make the finest paste, which will of course receive the greatest quantity of sand, a maximum of 3 parts to the 1 quicklime, I would stress, generally into it without losing toughness beyond a certain degree compared to a hydraulic material, and requires the least labour to bring it to the desired consistency. It's the most efficiently prepared, and so on. Hence, mortar made of such lime is the least expensive, and in dry work above ground, the difference of hardness compared to with others is less apparent. This is then sorry, I normally swear there, this man, Henry Scott, a Royal Engineer who thought hydraulic materials were all you should use for everything, and who was, as so many in that period, utterly condemnatory of craft practice. Whatever they say, well, if the bricklayers do that, it must be wrong, because they're inherently lazy and idle. I'm going to tell you how you should do it. And that's a common thing that's going on in Britain after about 1860. So he's saying it is a difficult matter to alter the practice of those who have grown grey in exalting practical experience and in the comfortable persuasion that the bricklayer knows best how to make good mortar and can be trusted to make. This is just contemptuous sneering at the crafts. It's class struggle, that's what's going on. But I look confidently forward to the day in which we shall feel quite independent, as respects mortar make, of the workman's traditions. Now, Henry Scott, having liberated different workman's traditions, it went on to invent a plaster material called Scots cement, which was a mixture of natural hydraulic lime and gypsum for exterior use in the British climate. It was an absolute disaster. You know, West Kensington, all these places, all the buildings were rendered with this wonderful patented material that had finally freed itself from craft traditions, and it failed everywhere. And the reason that that part of London today is everywhere rendered with Portland cement is because of the failure of his material being replaced. Yeah. So I'm going to end that, but except to say, I have to say, in many parts of the world, this is where we are today. We're still there. We're using materials designed by chemists with all these ingredients that confound the performance of the mortar, make it not work. They're not workable. They're all these different things. So we're still there. We need to leave there. We need to start making our own mortars again, and we need the crafts to be much more influential in what those mortars are and what they need to be. Not ignore what the crafts know to be true in their heart of hearts, yeah? Shall we have a break?
Yes.
On. Just to finally, this little thing about pure lime. This is a lime producer in Vermont in the USA in the 19th century, I think, but he's advertising the fact that his lime is 99.5% pure. Why would he do that if it's not what the masons wanted to use, you know? And where I worked and do occasionally in British Columbia, Vancouver Island, the local lime, which was scarce, but they found it all out, was 96% pure, which is a fat lime. You know, the definition of a fat lime typically, historically, is up to 6% clay. It's still called a fat lime. It works the same and all that. And the main benefit of having a maybe 5% pozzolan, either naturally or added in, is that it reduces initial shrinkage. The mortar won't be stronger in the long run for having that there. It's a craft thing to reduce initial shrinkage, because we all find that irritating. Obviously we do. You know, that's what that's about. But so, after about 10, 20 years of use of that lime, the 96% pure in British Columbia, in Vancouver Island, I should say, they switched to the San Juan Islands over in the US, which is 99% pure. So they're switching from a less pure to a more pure lime. Why would they do that if it's not what they wanted? Maybe this isn't such a hard argument in this country, but it's a bloody hard argument in Britain, because there's this narrative that masons always wanted impure limes, they wanted hydraulic, and it's not true. The evidence simply does not support that. It says the opposite. So that, and just this one here where, you know, fat limes are preferred and so on, and then down here, Searle, hydraulic limes behave like a mixture of fat lime and Portland cement, except without the predictability and reliability of that mixture of Portland cement and sand. But in chemical composition, they are very, very similar. So, okay. And just to give a specification, the Canadian Parliament building, I know that, don't get me wrong here, John Ashurst was a wonderful man, yeah? And he made a massive contribution to everything we're doing. But he specified the addition of latex at the Parliament building back in the day, and that is probably the wettest fabric I've ever seen in my life, yeah? And there are lots of lime premix producers now advocating the addition of latex to the mortars. Don't do it, right? And so, but look at this spec. The mortar to be used as hot as possible, and no more mortar to be mixed in one day than can be used on the same. Now, when you see that, which is, you often just see that bit, no more to be mixed in that day than can be used that day. This is this idea that was common, that the lime mortar is best when it's used the freshest possibly after making. And the longer you lay it down for, as with lime putty, the weaker it might become. Now, they might be wrong about that, but that was a firm, solid belief for 2,000 years. Use it as fresh as you can. And you might interpret that as meaning it's hydraulic, but no, when they did use hydraulic limes, they're very clear. As soon as that starts to stiffen, throw it away, because the hydraulic set has started. And if you knock it up, you remove it. And if you knock it up again, as St. Astier told you to do over a 36-hour period, you might end up with you've knocked out all the a significant proportion of the hydraulicity is gone. So anyway, that's the Canadian Parliament building. They've just spent $2 billion repointing the west wing of this complex with a hydraulic lime that has 3% free lime in it. So they've wasted, in my opinion. They will be back on that building in 20 years' time. Okay. So earth mortars, we're going to scoot through this, but this is the historic. At last, finally, the conservation world in Britain is taking earth and earth-lined mortars absolutely seriously. We have spent 40 years ignoring their existence. Believe me. So quickly then, as we go through, the so-called oldest house in France, probably debatable, highly debatable, but that's a beautiful picture. You'll see it posted a lot on Facebook. Earth lime built, masonry, earth lime plasters, and it would of course have had a lime finish over it, a pure lime or very pure lime finish. This is one of our local churches, a former priory church, much reduced from what it was. One of the most beautiful buildings in Britain, in my opinion, because it's been unmolested by later change. Early English masonry style, unmolested since it was done. But this church, as every church I know in Britain, built with earth lime mortars. You know, in the French tradition, obviously. It burned, actually, that burned. They took off a whole story here, and that's a 15th century window that was put. And in most cases lime washed at the least. Lime wash giving you a fully capillary active surface. That's the thing. You're not relying just on the joints to manage that moisture that's received. You've got a whole surface that's 100% surface area, capillary active to the optimal level, and incredibly durable. Lime washes will last if we make them right. You do not, and they did not make lime wash from lime putty diluted. That is rubbish. It's a crap material. You can't put it on any thickness. You make it from quicklime and you apply it hot. I've never seen more than 3 coats of lime wash specified historically. None of this 7 water thin coats nonsense. So, okay, I'll move on through there. And just a few shots of the inside this house. So high status building. And from my perspective, for me, this is where this journey started. I've been using a weak hydraulic lime because I didn't know what the alternative was until we worked on this building, and I was confronted by earth lime mortars, and all of this. And I wanted clearly to use mortars that were compatible with that fabric. It's important to say the capillarity of a typical earth lime mortar is the same as the capillarity, more or less, of a lime-rich mortar. So that's the compatibility we were talking about. If that pointed mortar is less capillary active, that's a problem for the mortars inside that wall. Yeah. So it's an early gentry house. Just to emphasise its status, this is not. It's a common belief in the UK that they used mud because they didn't have any money. No, they used it because the masons chose it and it was the optimal material. Because quickly go back to that. Up there is Castle Howard. I mean, that's the palatial. You might have heard of it. If you watch Bridgerton on the telly, they're filming it there at the moment, but on Netflix. But not that I want to advertise Netflix, but it's a grand palace built with earth lime mortars because the mason chose the mortars, not Hawksmoor and Vanbrugh, the very celebrated Romanesque architects in Britain. They didn't have any, that wasn't their business. The mortars were the business of the master mason. And that is a situation that was the common situation in Britain till about 1870, 1880. And that's the context of Henry Scott saying, craftsmen know nothing. I know best. I'm an engineer. That's when the change happened. When that specification of the mortars was taken from the crafts by the professionals. I don't want to say any more than that. For whatever reason, after that, things started to change for the worst. Yeah. In terms of mortars, that's what I'm talking about. So quickly just jump on again. So in York House, we have the whole panoply. Here's an earth lime backing coat with hay to resist the shrinkage. Very lime rich. On analysis, these are about 90% pure lime, 10% limestone dust. Why 10%? Well, we need to find out why, I suppose, is all I can say. But 10%. And the rest is hair, ox hair, cow hair, typically. This one, and this is the fabric of that building I just showed you. Limestone laid in mud, earth lime mortars, dubbed out, plastered in earth. That's an earth lime plaster, but with the staining from the lime finish coat that's come off. That's why it looks white. And then as they transitioned away from earth lime into lime sand, often there's still clay in there to some extent, and we have evidence that they deliberately added clay, which is contrary to what everyone might expect, but hugely lime rich. And yeah, in terms of plastering, if we're using very lime rich plasters, we need to have a lot of hair in there to resist that shrinkage. But that's quite a structural ingredient in terms of flexural strength and all these things. So, and this is just an example of us working in, and this was actually נייג'el, a student from Bhutan, an architect from Bhutan. I learned a lot from her about earth building, because of course Bhutan that's what it is, and so on. So this is reinstatement where it had been compromised by later materials that were stopping it from breathing, yeah? And this is just a brief analysis of a typical earth lime plaster from molten. 1 quicklime, 3.1 clay bearing subsoil. So that's actually quite lime rich. As Bill said, the analyst, that is the only 1 lime to 3 mortar he has ever analysed in his life, because lime sand mortars are never that lean.
3.1.
Well, yeah. Well, he's very accurate, Bill. And whoever said that's pedantic, yeah, but essentially 1 to 3. It's more often no more than 10% or 20% lime. And in Spain, most of the round earth structures that Valencia University have analysed, most of the round earth structures in Spain have 10 or 20% lime addition. Who knew? But that's the case. And it's because when you add a little bit of lime to an earth, it transforms that material into something completely different, far more workable, and all these things. That's just some data, but a lot of these I just like, you're going to get this slideshow so you can read them. These are building accounts typically, and we only find earth lime mortars in building accounts, not experts. They didn't write about them, except the French, they did. But so you can see the ingredients of an earth lime mortar being delivered to site there, and so on. Spain, Valencia, just to give you an overview here, earth lime bedding mortars very much in Roman tradition, hot mixed lime pointing mortars over the top. Valencia in Spain. That's a 17th century merchant's house in the old city in Valencia. This near us in York, near York, this is the system we're talking about. Earth lime bedding mortars struck almost at the face, laid over with a little layer of lime. They're not hacking it back that deep. It's laid on like a localized plaster, and that one is just pure lime and hair, nothing else, just lime and hair. But it's not hot mixed in the sense that we are talking about, but it's essential that you slate lime putty in the right way to get the right material, and we don't do that today. I mean, no doubt, we do not slate lime putty properly. And then Calvados in Normandy, but all of these mortars could be in my village. They're in Normandy, but they could also be they're exactly the same. And looking at a universal material here, all around the world. Asturias, northwest Spain, the same. Earth lime bedding mortars, sometimes just clay. I mean, if the clay was enough, they wouldn't add the lime, didn't feel the need for it. But then dubbed out with a hot lime, dubbing out, plastered with the hot lime, and then finished with a hot lime wash. Made from quick lime, applied when it's still hot. Very different material to what we think lime wash is. Yeah. And on timber frames in Britain, everywhere, the same system, except within the panels. And in China, on the Great Wall, they've in recent years realised, well, maybe it wasn't such a good idea to use cement, even though we produce more cement than anywhere in the world in history. We're not going to use it on the Great Wall of China. We're going to use quicklime mortars and earth lime mortars. And the traditional earth lime mix in China for most buildings, including the Forbidden Palace buildings, is 70% loam, 70% clay bearing subsoil, 30% slate lime. That's the traditional mix in China, and it's topped over with a very pure lime, very rich, if not entirely lime pointing. So it's the same system in China as it is in Normandy, as it is in everywhere. This is what I'm trying to get across. And this, just to counter the Saint Astier argument that all they ever used in France was NHL, particularly theirs, of course, is that I would say that's a 20th century building built with earth lime infill panels and the same lime system over the top. I might be wrong on the date of it, but my feeling is it's that. And then is this a structural material? This tower has been just in Lincolnshire, in Britain, 1,000 years. And that is, any mason I think would agree with me, that's a very plumb structure. You know, plumb by meaning it's straight. And the earth lime, the lime bedding, pointing mortars fell away for the most, they're still there in places, but they fell away long ago, and that has proved a remarkably durable material in the weather, in the British weather, earth lime. So they don't need the lime really, they didn't know that, they didn't say that. The lime is to drive that capillary extraction, I would say, because it's the more capillary active material compared to that. So, and then repairs, this is our local church, Anglo-Scandinavian church, so, and we're deep filling with earth lime, which is what it was built with, and then pointing with hot mix lime over the top of that. And then this one, just put this in for, there is some difference in use, not in performance in my opinion, between modern quicklime and traditionally burned. And I burn in my little kiln, not for everything I do, I wish I could, I wish that could make sense. I haven't got the time as most of it. So during the first lockdown, I burned some local limestone, I slaked it to a hydrate and immediately mixed in hair, nothing else, no sand, pointed the wall, so that's just after pointing. And then this is within a week or two, it's carbonated on the face, not at the depth, at the face. And that's an entirely durable mortar, and there's nothing there but lime and hair, okay? And the only aggregate is the little bits of grit around which the ooids formed on the seabed. You know, that's the core that they rolling around, they gathered calcium to themselves and became limestone in the end. But so, and this is the kind of stickiness we're talking about of a mortar like that, yeah?
Well, what you say would be the difference between your burnt lime and, let's say, an industrial one?
Shrinkage is the key difference. That's
More shrinkage
with the modern, yeah. We'll talk about this afternoon, yeah. So if we look, this is what's been going on. When this all started, as I say, it was driven from below, but the heritage organisations listened and were open to this, and they got involved. So we've got Historic Environment Scotland, Historic England, CADU, which is the Welsh equivalent, OPW, which is the Irish equivalent, Public Works, the Heritage Council of Ireland, all in a group to move this forward, to understand, to commission the research, to drive the research. And that's ongoing. It's all on. There's lots of research being commissioned into so we can understand these mortars. For me as a craftsman, I know they're right, but we do need to have the data as well. But that's subsequently, you know. And I have to tell you, at the very least, Historic Scotland and Historic England collaborating on anything is unprecedented, right? They are in absolute competition with one another all of the time. But hot mix has made these alliances. That's all I'm going to say. These alliances have come out of this movement. I will call it a movement. It is a movement. But so anyway, that's just to give you some idea. But you can look at that. And then so this is the Historic England position a while back now. But hot mix mortar embraces both non-hydraulic and gauged hydraulic pozzolanic mixes prepared with quicklime and used hot. It also covers mortars prepared by hot mixing and then stored, either as a dry hydrate, aggregate mix, or as a coarse stuff, and used at a later date when the materials are cold. This then embraces a huge palette of different types of mortar prepared by the same method. The method is the key here, for a wide variety of applications, as was the case of historically, all of which can be prepared by hot mixing. So that's the best definition. We get lots of NHL suppliers typically saying to homeowners, hot mix won't work. And you think, well, what is hot mix? It's a method, yeah, by which the most efficiently prepared mortars that give us the properties we want. It's a method, it's not a single thing. It's not NHL 3.5 you use for every possible thing, yeah? It's not a one-use mortar, everything does mortar. A Historic Environment Scotland, now this was their position 4 years ago, so like-for-like repair should be the starting point. Not all lime is traditional lime. You have to read between the lines on this one. Not all lime is traditional lime. Not all lime products are technically compatible with traditional buildings. Not all lime products are aesthetically compatible with traditional buildings. we encourage the use of traditional lime mortars for conservation and repair. We do not fund the use of formulated limes, i.e. premixes, okay? They will not fund them. That position has changed. For the last 3 years, their position has been, as an organisation, we will not support the use of natural hydraulic lime, wherever we have influence over that decision. They will not support it. And they've even went so far as to say, even if you can show us that the original mortar was natural hydraulic lime, you would have to demonstrate that the one you propose to use is exactly the same in its performance and characteristics and composition as the one they did use. So, that's their position, and that's a hard position. Historic England are not far behind, but there's a lot more politics involved in Historic England's, well, I won't go into that, not now anyway. So, just to give you some idea, and this is a bit old, but these are some of the major projects around the world actually where hot mixes have been used. So, Calgary, Alberta, that is the norm in Calgary now. Earthline mortars were very common, and pertinently because Ukrainian emigrants took earthline mortar technology to Canada at that time in the 19th century. So the Memorial Library in Calgary, Coal Island where I work, historic site in Victoria, but the North York Moors National Park, Maria will not allow the use of natural hydraulic lime, full stop. It has to be like for like, and there is no like for like use in our region. Wrexham, a big town in Wales, and Wakefield in Yorkshire, where the money is given to do the historic buildings in the town as a grant, all only with hot mixes, no hydraulic lines in that equation. York Conservation Trust that own 85 of some of the most important historic buildings in York. Canterbury Cathedral, York Minster, that's York Minster. I said yesterday it was Lincoln Cathedral. What an idiot I am. It's not. I'm sure you knew that, did you? But anyway, York Minster. I burned the lime for York Minster because they use a magnesium lime, as they did when they built it, and you can't buy that. So I burn their offcuts when they're doing the masonry, burn the lime. That's a nice circle, yeah, in sustainability terms. It used to just get thrown away, the waste stone. Durham Cathedral, Westminster Abbey, Grace Court, which is a big grand place near London. Reading Abbey ruins was all done with that. Scampston Hall, another big grand house. Crowland Abbey Church, Holy Trinity Church, I did that, that's the oldest in York. City of York in general, although anyway. And more interestingly from a frost perspective, Nidaros Cathedral in Trondheim, the most northerly cathedral in the world. And Stavanger Cathedral in Norway, where Emma, my apprentice, has been working now for 3 years. And just a few little things. Unless he's a water juggler, that's steam, yeah? So that's a hot mixing on a medieval site. This is hot mixing in Sweden. You can see the steam rising, and you can see also that is being mixed, and that's going straight up to those guys to be used. So no dwell times. I'm not going to dwell on this, but when I say I've been through building accounts, this is, in a good case, this is what you get. So this is for this house. It was before they later clad it in stone, but underneath is the brick building that they're talking about here. And just look at the detail. There is no room for error in some of these. And in the terms of lime, which is a chalk lime, a pure lime, 1,111 1/8 loads. This is not just random, this is very precise. And you will also see here 19¼ bushels of taris, that's another spelling of trass, volcanic ash, and that is used for cisterns and for the water the water tanks and things. It's a water lime, yeah, and cow hair and everything else. But I've been through hundreds of these. So traditional mortar proportions, I've talked about that. What I want to say, just to make this clear, you will very, very rarely find a lime mortar that is leaner than 1 lime to 2 anywhere in the world, and they're often richer than that. And that is achieved by mixing at 1 quicklime to 3 typically, because although that's 2 to 3, on analysis, of course, there are lime lumps in there that are not binders. So in terms of binder terms, and whenever they specify slate lime, whenever you see, in Britain anyway, whenever you see 1 lime to 3 sand, that means quicklime. They knew that, they didn't have to say it. But if they wanted slate lime, they explicitly say slate lime. And that is 1 to 2 at the leanest, yeah? So that's kind of what tells us what they're aiming for.
Also for bedding mortars? Like
Yeah, all of them. Yeah, well, except when they weren't using earth lime, of course. Yeah. And the hydraulic limes is too. They were made from quicklime, but they do not expand anything like as much. Sometimes not, if they're eminently hydraulic, not very, hardly at all. So they're mixing those at 1 to 2 as a minimum, as the leanest. And again, we mix at 1 to 3. That is not right. Okay, that's not. It's one of the reasons then they've got so little workability. You mix at 1 to 2, there's a bit more workability, you know. But and so an earth lime mortars, as I said, we've said 10 to 20%. Now these are all traditional slaking methods. I'm not going to dwell on those. Those are for you to read later. But primarily because we're going to be talking about them this afternoon with the materials in front of us. But it's just to show you that the ordinary or common method, and that's what it's called in every country I know, telling us that is the method that's used most of the time for most things. And that's to reduce lump lime to a size that you can mix with the sand. That's all it's about. So the ordinary method, a ring of sand, quicklime in the middle, give it water, not the other way around, give it the water it needs in just sufficient, bank it over to slake for a little while. And the slaking of a pure lime takes 2 or 3 minutes. It's not hours, yeah, it's 2 or 3 minutes. As I say, the slaking of a hydraulic lime, maybe 12 hours, maybe 36. So it's a completely different thing. Direct mixing powdered quicklime with sand, not as uncommon as we think. They did pulverize their lime, and they always say when they use it that it made the strongest mortar of all. I would say that is simply because it is all binder. There are no lumps, yeah? Aspersion or immersion, that's just dribbling water on it. Enough, just sufficient, as they always say, to slake it to a dry hydrate, and then you can make it to a paste. But after the slake is complete. We'll talk about all this afternoon. Air slaking, just leaving it in the air to slake, that can take 6 months. They all talk about it and then they'll go on and say, but nobody does that. You know, I mean, it's one of those things. And then sand slaking, which is that method, but you let it all go cold. And has been much confused over the years by John Ashurst, by many people. They think that is hot mixing. But if you put that lime in the middle, you give it the water, you bank it over and you walk away for a couple of days, and when you come to mix the sand with the lime, it's cold. That is not hot mixing, that is sand slaking. You're just using the sand as the container in which you slake the lime. That's all you're doing to a cold material. Very different outcome in terms of workability and so on. And just a little example from Chicago, you know, a layer of sand, the quicklime, give it that, mix it to a mortar, put it out to sit ready for use. Simple process. And that's Chicago in 1924, okay, not in the midst of time. Now, this quote here, I'm going to dwell on this. 1703, another bricklaying book. When you slake the lime, take care to wet it everywhere a little, but do not over wet it, and cover with sand every laying or bed of lime, so that the steam or the spirit of the lime, this is a mystical thing, the spirit of the lime may be kept in, it's not, it may be kept in and not flee away, but mix itself with the sand, which will make the mortar much stronger than if you slake all your lime first and throw your sand on altogether at last, as some do. You know, this is not, we're not talking iron rules here, but this mention of steam is so common, and that this paragraph alone has launched a 50, with the pre-research and now Historic of England, a full block, £40,000 research project into what happens when you slake with steam. We know that what happens is something different, and that method, you're not only slaking with liquid water, some of the slake has been done by steam, yeah? And that's significant. Steam makes different bonds, I'm told, by the chemists and the physicists. So, yeah, that's all significant. So we won't, and then just other descriptions. I'm not going to dwell, but this description is the same. In France, this is a guy in London, but he was Irish. This is a description of powdered quicklime mixing, which is a different method, but we're going to do that this afternoon. And this is from Spain, again, ordinary method, exactly the same. And I'm confident that these methods are the same everywhere in the world, because these methods are driven by the material, by quicklime. That's what it asks, that's what it demands. And then this very long description from Gilmore in 1864 in America. This man was a genius. If you have any text, read Gilmore's writings. But he was an engineer, don't forget, so he likes hydraulic materials, but that's the description. And more surprisingly, this is pretty much exactly the same description from Modern Practical Building 1950, the book that architects, masons, anyone training would have been given in 1950, and he's describing hot mixing. That's all he's describing. This is another name for it, the larrying method. A larry is a hoe. So you're tempering and working it with a hoe beyond when you've got the water content right. But and there is a version of the ordinary method in Canada on the island. We used seawater to slate. We didn't use fresh water. We didn't have fresh water. Yeah. So and there, alongside other descriptions of powder mixing from France, de la Fay, and from Martin, and there is a version of that, if you like. So you mix everything together from the beginning. You don't need to go through a double handling. But we'll say we're going to do that. And then just this one, which is interesting, because we've got dry slaking, we've got wet slaking. You take it to a dry core stuff or a wet one. And this guy is making a distinction there. You'll do the dry slaking if you have to carry it to site. But if you're on site, you'll take it straight through to a wet usable mortar. That's just logistics, weight, different weights, and so on. You know, they didn't have pickup trucks, did they, in those days? So, and this one, just a quick one on this. When we did a workshop in Ottawa, I left Ottawa thinking I needed a bodyguard next time I came, but nonetheless, because engineers rule in Ottawa, but not in a good way. Yeah, but but so we sampled. We were hot mixing at the workshop, and the National Research Council was sampling those as we made them. These are the three we made, and you'll see that after 90 days, they're all 2 MPa. The one they did, which they thought was hot mixing before we arrived, was sand slaking. So they let it all go cold before they mixed it, and you'll see they're coming in at half the strength. So that's a fair indicator. When you hot mix, you're getting twice the compressive strength typically as you might get in a cold mixed mortar. So that's significant. You know, 2 MPa. Who needs more than that? We don't need more than that to build a 10-story building, as long as it's solid wall construction. Again, the US barrier standards are very clear. A 9-story building required a mortar that was, it could be as little strength as 1/3 of a Newton, 1/3 of an MPa was sufficient for a building of 9 stories, as long as the walls are solid wall construction. Yeah, that's the critical thing. So that's just a little insight, and further evidence is showing that. So hot mixed mortars with some pozzolan, but not a lot, in the Roman period. This Roman lighthouse, one of our few standing Roman buildings in Britain, and this is an analysis of a mortar, a Roman mortar, 2 Roman mortars, but this one from the bathhouse at Vindelander, so a wet, humid place. 8% brick pozzolan added to that, but the proportion, you know, 1 to 1.3, actually, in proportional terms. This one is a building mortar, a walling mortar, Roman again from the same period, and Bill was certain, the analyst, that was placed hot. That one wasn't, and mixed hot placed, and mixed hot and placed cold. So that one was mixed hot. The pozzolanic one, that one was mixed and then used a bit later. But the proportions you can see, very lime rich, and Roman, of course. So, and this building is linked in as far as this Anglo-Saxon church tower is built of Roman spolia from the nearby Corbridge Roman fort. So we've got Roman elements in that building. Sadly, the client, the Church Conservation Trust, could only afford to take the cement out of the top half, not the bottom half, but it does give us a nice example, because you can see how cloudy that is. That's because that fabric is wet, allowing lichens and algae and moss to grow. Slate lime is called dead lime, and it's live when it's quick lime. And of course, that's the same in English. Quick is Anglo-Saxon for alive. Yeah. Yeah, is it? Yeah. Well, it tells us a lot, though, isn't it, in that way. But anyway, that's Gilmore again. But that's him saying, sorry, I forgot the significance of that. He's saying, yes, engineers are saying you should make the lime and lay it down, all these things. But then at the end says, although the practice in this country, the USA, conforms to hot mixing with singular unanimity. So this you want to be careful when you read text. You often have to read between the lines. He's saying, oh, engineers are saying do that, but actually on site, this is what's happening, again, because it's us that were in charge of that. The masons are in charge of the mortars. So hot mixes, how do we identify them? I've chosen to use an example from Haifa. So just, this is plaster. There are the lumps that indicate hot mixing. They tend to be angular. They can be underburned lime, they can be overburned lime. They can just be lump lime that hadn't slaked at the point that the mortar was put on or in the wall, that then just carbonate as a lump, that's all. But they tend to be angular. If you've got big fluffy lumps, that indicates hydrate or lime putty, but you'll rarely see that because they didn't use lime putty, they did use hydrate. They made it on site, there and then. But so that's that, and this is the plaster finish, or before the final finish. That's the backing, obviously, but you can see very clearly, and there are the lime washes, which I would be certain were applied as a hot lime wash made directly from quicklime. So another example, this is a medieval brick from Hull, where bricks began to be made again from the earliest period. Here are the lumps indicating hot mixing. This is not a medieval brick, this is from a Frank Lloyd Wright building in Chicago, but we have exactly the same. For those masons in the room, why do American masons think that's a good idea, not to fully bed a brick when they bed it? It's wrong. There's no capillary movement in that space. So anyway, and then some projects. So this is the Folly and Settle. This was before it was repointed, so it's got cement in it. It's quite a nice day, so it's not a cheat, not entire cheat. This was done over the winter before last. So right through the winter, this was done by a guy who'd never used hot mixes before in his life. He was a lime worker, he'd used NHLs, he'd used lime putties. But so, and that, the only thing that wants, and I couldn't persuade the architect of that now wants lime washing, in my opinion, as it would have been in the past. But that's still a difficult argument in Britain, very often. Not always, but very often.
In terms of architecture?
Yeah, to lime wash is quite difficult. Changing the appearance, it hits. So other projects, this is another guy. I want to show these partly because I'm full of respect for these young guys. They've embraced this in the last year or two, and they are doing great work with it. And they're the ones taking this forward more than me. I hope that will happen in a way, because these are the young guys. These are the guys who are going to keep this going. We won't forget about it again, is what I'm saying. But he did this end the last year with NHL. Look at it. Lime bleeding down all over the place. This is in West Yorkshire, so high driven rain index. He then early this year, or just last, I then turned him over to hot mixing. He'd been going to the Scottish Lime Centre Trust, learning about the wonders of NHL. But he did this, and then obviously he could see the difference. This is dry, that's not dry, and so on. And then at his own expense, having finished that, removed all of that NHL and put hot mix in. So that's a guy with integrity and and fully understands what's going on. But I hope that gives you some idea of the difference in the same climate and everything else with the same stone. This is not a false comparison. Other work, local builder, never used lime before, probably not even NHL before. That's their work. This another guy who's recently converted to hot mixing in Norfolk. And this is what's happening all over the country. And a lot of this happened. I mean, this is a guy that I turned over just on Facebook during lockdown, because there was all this activity on the lime groups. And there's a guy in Vermont that I spoke to regularly on Facebook. He's now set up as a lime supplier, selling quicklime and everything else. And so it doesn't, you don't have to be face to face. Not that I'm a huge fan of Facebook, don't get me wrong, but blimey, it can have effects. And in Canada, similarly, projects have been done by people who just talked to us on Facebook and then gone and done it. And they've been hugely successful. And this is what's happening everywhere around Britain, in the States, all over the place. So it's not just the big projects. This is an older one of ours, but that's a hot mix there. That was done 6 months before with NHL2. Now, you might say there's not a great difference, but there is in my opinion, there's a significant difference in water content in those two walls. Other jobs done by other masons with hot mixes, hot mix plastering, hot lime washing, and that's in Fort McMurray in Alberta. and that was that big forest fire that they had approaching it a few years back, but it didn't quite get there. Okay, so and then hot mix is historic. You know, the ability to build flint work with a hot mix mortar is probably the only mortar that you could build flint work with. You've got not porous nodules, and you can, with lime putty or NHL even, you can build maybe 2 courses and then they all start to swim around. So you've got to stop for 2 weeks. And some people actually go as far as that's what they did historically. And of course, why would they do that? No, but with a hot mix, you can just build straight up with flint, with non-porous stones, and you do not get swimming. We'll talk about that later, why that is. And something, a Saxon church, again, obviously hot mixes, and little brick noggins as well. These are just half bricks, you know, but it works. The Old Sun Inn, this is one of Maria's particular projects in the national park, from, I think, that section 14th century maybe, 15th certainly, and then it's accreted areas. It was pointed with 116, 82. On the face of it, that's not causing major damage to the stone. But when we thought inside that, on the other side of that wall, where next to the door, the lime wash was very wet and damp, clearly damp. So we justified what we wouldn't otherwise perhaps have been able to justify, doing a sample panel. And in the course of that, it was quickly apparent to me, and I'd been working from the inside through the lockdown. It's one of my lockdown hideouts. Through the earth lime and earth mortars inside were wet, and yet the outside didn't appear to be. So, but of course, what had happened? They hadn't made contact. When they'd repointed, they hadn't contacted the new mortars with the old mortars, and so you had voids. And again, vapor is not going to jump from there to there and come out, and capillary movement can't work. We had a problem at this end. We did this inside this gable here. It's up here, and the earlier it was lime plaster, but salts had really started to rip it apart because of moisture coming through and then drying in the summers. We couldn't work it out. We thought this has been renewed, and we thought there was a problem there, so we dealt with that. And then the next winter, all this plaster became saturated again. So we then bit the bullet and said, right, so last April I took that out, and this is up on the moors, high wind driven index, west facing, so getting all of the rain, hitting it. So that's just a straight ordinary hot mix, no pozzolan, except a little bit of wood ash, not a lot. And we did it. The thatch was repaired, and this winter the whole wall is dry all of the time. So, and that's just and this is just taking back to what we were talking about at the beginning. When I knocked out the cement, the 116 and NHL that had been used in places subsequently, none of that mortar had made a bond with the stone at all. It's there, and you can't see that it hasn't made a bond. But so it took me half the time, if not more, even less than that, to take it out. It's still bloody irritating because it's hard and it's wedged, but no bond. So, you know, simple. That's why the water was coming through the wall every time it rained. And now we've got a hot mix with a good bond. No water comes through. So I hope, case closed, I hope, you know, but, and we will get the rest done eventually. And then this is the inside with hot lime washes. So, and look at the radiance of these, you know. That's Maria, actually. She was helping me, and she was doing that, and she didn't know I was going to lime wash the window. So I'd done it, and then she turned around and said, oh my God, I didn't know you were going to... But it was lime washed before, and it is again now, and that's that. So, but, and that's a different colour, obviously, but the colour of that is coming from my own burned lime. We did use, in this particular building, I did burn the lime for it, and of course it's reflecting the colour of the stone, so it's not white, it's cream. But that's coming from the lime, you know. And then quickly the Yemen, we're into lime putty. Are we doing all right for time? Lime putty, this is bread dough, lime putty, this is the Yemen. The only real, in this part of the Yemen, in the earth building regions of the Yemen, they only use lime for lime washing. So yeah, they're not hot lime washing, they're not doing that. But traditionally, they would beat this lime that they're going to make into a lime wash only. 3 days. 2 men, 3 days. Thwonk. Thwonk. These days they do it for 1 day, but there's still a lot, isn't it? And they actually, I've seen it, they put this lime wash on with their hands, yeah? There's a great film out there, if you have Mud Masons of the Yemen, if you can get it, it's one of the most inspiring films ever made. The Mud Masons of the Yemen, every time I see stuff on the news, I'm thinking, where are these guys now, you know, with what's going on in the Yemen? But they're wonderful guys, and then just for a little laugh, that's a couple of traditional Spanish lime workers, i.e. the woman of the house in Spain, because annual lime washing in Spain, as in lots of places, is not because of need, not because the material has failed, it's for antiseptic qualities. It's spring cleaning is what it is, yeah? And of course it's done typically by the woman of the house, and her only health and safety equipment is her apron, yeah? So, yeah, and I just wish I had one of her up on the top of that ladder somehow. But anyway, this isn't lime wash, this is linseed oil, sand cast linseed oil on joinery. This is Capability Brown, very famous landscape architect, and that's a colour wash, so no lime in that. Alum as the binder, and beer. Alum and old beer and pigment, but on the back a hot lime wash, 2 coats. And I think you can see straight away that's giving you a very different surface to the lime wash we think was lime wash, yeah, the very thin stuff, watery thin stuff. Well, it's not a before, that's a joinery, that's all timber. And so on, except for the stone here, and everything's timber. It's an illusion, except for the stone at the bottom level. But a very important structure, and then lime washed, as I say, on the back. Lime washed brickwork. Shelter coat. This is one of my projects, and that church that I showed earlier in Malton, beautiful, in beautiful condition for all that it was built in 1250. Yeah. But we've had a hell of a lot of salt problem down at this level. Crowland Abbey, and I've got this in, those that know, the lime revival is always said to have started at Wells Cathedral in Somerset with Professor Baker, but there were 2. Crowland Abbey is the other, where the lime revival started in Britain. This is work by Robert and Eve Baker, and guys that trained me at Nimbus Conservation worked here too, and worked at Wells. So I am in a direct line of descent from the lime revival. Some think so. I'm betraying that training in a way, but I'm not. That's where that 40 years later. That's the lime method with lean lime putty mixes. So, yeah, it's not done any damage, but it's lasted 40 years. It's quite gratifying to me with this a phrase which I didn't coin, the new lime revival, where we are now. That same project has been done it was done 5 years ago now, with hot mixes throughout. Hot mix mortars, hot mix pointing, hot mix shelter coats. And they're very different animals for anyone who wants, we can talk about that later. And the conservator, obviously had only ever used lime putty typically, said, well, it's a lime wash with some aggregate in it to imitate the colour, match the colour of the new stone. That's the idea. And to offer a sacrificial layer over the top. So you mortar repair and then you bring it all together with a shelter coat. I think it's great, and it's a Robert Baker thing. Again, everything he did was admirable, except for the mistake he made about the line proportions and so on. So his original work lasted 40 years. I am absolutely confident that this work that's now been done will last 100, 200 years. That's the difference we're talking about here. And if you really want sacrificiality, if the fabric is so important that you can't possibly risk, then yeah, lime putty is the way, but it's not going to last. And we're in a world where we need to be sustainable. It is not good enough with lime putty too lean, or NHLs, because that's the pattern, that you need to do it every 20 years. Again, that's not sustainable, is it? We need to be using a mortar that delivers the performance, that looks after these buildings, that will last indefinitely in the absence of obvious decay mechanisms. So isn't that sustainability in action? That's where we need to be now. And then lime putty again. This was the norm in the 20th century. You can see this pit is 3 meters deep. These were hideous health and safety things for kids who like playing on building sites and everything else. But this is the first time in Britain, 1937, earlier of course, where they are running lime to putty for the first time really. But again, they're having, even though they're filling that 10-foot deep pit, they're taking that lime putty out typically after 2 weeks, and it's still hot because you've got such a huge volume of it to cool down. And I would say they overcame their historic suspicion about its binding qualities, because by this time they were always going to gauge it with Portland cement. That overcame that. I've done experiments now, and if you make I actually do it 138, so because Portland cement has got harder and harder, so a 129 now would be much stronger than a 129 then. So you amend that, one Portland cement, 3 putty lime, 8 sand, creates a mortar that is as workable almost as a hot mix. So that, I believe, is the real reason they're using lime putty for the first time, because they're getting a material that is very like what they've just stopped using, i.e. a hot mix that's very workable, very sticky and so on, and very lime rich. You know, that's 75% of the binder, and that is lime, yeah? That's probably twice what there is in one of the more lime rich NHLs, twice the free lime. So, and that's, I won't dwell there, but that's a scaffolder who giving me this oral, because he was a scaffolder going around everywhere, telling me what they did, because in his observation. And you can see no more than 2 weeks before using it, still hot and dangerous in his opinion, when they opened the pit to use it. And then the guy who was talking to his granddad about it said, well, what about hot mixing as we're talking about? He said straight away, no, he's a stonemason. His granddad said, no, that's your crowd. The stonemasons who used it like that. This is 1950s Liverpool, yeah? It's not in the mists of time, history. So lime putty is used on its own. This is 1893 construction. This is the mortar from 1893, and that's in Scotland, the place where they tell us you can only ever use natural hydraulic lime, but that has proved entirely durable for over 100 years in Scotland, and that's the other place there in gauge brickwork, as we call it. And here again, but this is Pasley describing the term putty, better known as the cement for fixing window glass. So it's he feels the need to explain what it is. It's not so common. Is applied to brickwork which is nearly the same as hot lime grout. It is made by dissolving a small quantity of water, as much hot lime as when slaked and continually stirred up. Oh, sorry, yeah, that's right. We'll assume the consistency of mud. It is then sifted. So the strategy is not to lay it down for late slaking, it's to actually push it through a sieve to remove those lumps in order to remove the unburnt parts of the lime, and should be used without delay. So this afternoon you'll see some maybe 20-year-old aged lime putty that we made 2 days ago, if that doesn't sound silly. But and then a similar description, and again, note, take out the groat, use a hair sieve. If anyone can tell me what a hair sieve looked like, I'd love to know. Unimaginable to me, a hair sieve. But anyway, take out the gross parts of the lime, is fit for use, immediate, and I would say hot use. And if you mix a lime putty made like that when it's still hot, the outcome is that's a hot mix method, yeah? It's not what we think. And that's Barty Langley. So, yeah, I used lime putty in my career. Obviously I did. This is back in '92 we did this on the Isle of Portland with 1 to 3 lime putty. It's lasted, you know, I'm not saying it doesn't. It's not a material that any builder is ever going to use. It's not going to mainstream lime. That's what I believe about it. Whereas our experience right now, because we're upskilling ordinary builders in the national park and elsewhere, they love hot mix material. They are going to take, in many ways in our country, it's ordinary builders that are going to take this forward, not conservators, because a lot of them are still resisting and, oh no, we want to use natural hydraulic lime and all this. So, you know, this is a weird contradiction, because the lime revival has spent the last 40 years condemning ordinary builders as idiots, as all these things. But they're the ones who are recognizing the utility of a hot mix more, and they're using it even when Maria's not making them. That's the point. And these are guys that previously only used sand and cement. Yeah. So, and then plastering again, it's only in the 20th century that plaster was made with lime putty. And this is 1780. The plasterers who make their mortar by the hot mix method and lay the mortar down to allow for late slaking. Again, the method gives the quality, if you have to lay it down for a period. But again, you'd be surprised that that's not usually more. I mean, Nicholson is a guy who says, well, you have to lay it down for a long time to allow for late slaking. And then in the next sentence is, so after a week, use it. So the time is different is in their world to ours. And so that's just a description of that. This is another one, but from Miller, this book is biblical in Britain, 1898. But he's saying, yeah, limes which are unsuitable for plasterwork, known as hot limes, i.e. used hot, not mixed hot, not mixed hot, but used hot, they have to maybe lay down, not 3, sometimes, depending on the lime, sometimes 3 months. There's that figure. I've only seen that twice in history. Alberti in 1460, and this guy. That's the only time laying down for 3 months is mentioned.
Why would you say 3 months?
Well, it depends on the lime, because it's to get rid of the slaking. But most importantly, he says, that's for plastering, but for ordinary hot limes are the limes mostly used for building purposes. Yeah, everything else. 1898, okay, in London. Just a few examples: hot lime wash, hot mix mortars. I didn't do this. Sam Baxter, a friend of mine, did, but I designed and managed this for Natural England. Natural England, who are the the landscape people, they supported the use of hot mixes right from the get-go and allowed us to build a portfolio of success in a way, if you like. And yeah, beautiful work. That's in my village, actually. In York, this is a project we did. We replaced an awful lot of these timbers because they've been cement rendered, and that had just caused massive decay. This is one of the oldest frames in York, 1430. And you can see we've lime washed the whole, which is the traditional way. When all the infill panels reinstated with hot mix bricks laid in hot mix and hot mix plasters, then hot lime wash over the whole. This is another hot mix job. That's the frame under here, but only under here, is 1316. Part of the oldest timber frame. It's a long terrace in York, the oldest timber frame in Britain. This is the only part of that timber frame that has got a compatible lime mortar on. The rest is rendered in cement, and the timber frame is rotting. And it is the oldest, 1316 in York. And it's a disgrace. It's a disgrace. But anyway, and the back of it looks like that, and that's hot mix pointed. Again, done over a really hard winter 2 winters ago. No issues with frost. So, hydraulic lime. Hey, look, we're within sight of the end. Sorry, Maria and I spent 5 hours, well, Maria particularly, reordering this talk last night to make sure I could get through it in 2 hours, or hopefully that I could get through it in 2 hours. Right, hydraulic lime. So this is in Moulton. This is the quay, historic quay. Troussart, a contemporary of Vicat. Although we give this compound the name of hydraulic lime, it ought in fact to be regarded as a substance altogether different from lime. It is a new body with new properties. I wish we'd understood that a few years ago, and he's right. Okay, so Robert Boynton again, 1980, not very long ago. A major problem confronting most hydraulic lime manufacturers is lack of uniformity in the finished project, namely shipping a lime with a cementation index of 0.92 one day, 0.7 the next, and so on. The chemical analyses of impure deposits frequently change abruptly from one ledge and stratum to another. Blending of stone to secure a composite analysis alleviates this problem to some extent, but can never be pursued with the same flexibility. And I have to say, I'm on camera. I shouldn't say, but I am.
Say it.
They don't give a shit about that in the industry. It's as it comes today. I mean, sorry, that's the least of my swear words actually. So, furthermore, the intensive analytical testing that it entails is costly. It does happen in the Portland cement industry. But it's easier for whatever reason. This chronic problem of quality control, more than any other factor, has forced hydraulic lime to lose position primarily to Portland cement and masonry cement. And you would argue cement lime, because that's a predictable version of the same. And this is David Jefferson, who's a very eminent and belligerent, but highly respected and highly good. Sorry, I'm struggling for words. This is his opinion. The use of natural hydraulic lime has become extremely common in conservation work in recent years. The reasons for this are not clear, although a complete ignorance of what the material consists of, coupled with hard selling by the manufacturers, are probably the two main factors. And I couldn't disagree with him. Yeah. He worked 30 years in the cement industry before he does what he does now, so he kind of knows how these things work. So the British standard in the past for feebly hydraulic lime, which we called in the 20th century semi-hydraulic lime, this is after 28 days, a maximum of 2 MPa, a minimum of less than half an MPa. And as I've just said to you, we get those strengths reliably with a pure lime hot mix. So, but feebly hydraulic lime again, 5% clay typically. The incentive to use that was not strength, because I've seen plenty of analyses from this period where actually with the same sand and everything and the same proportions, the pure lime delivers the stronger mortar. The feebly hydraulic lime is a weaker mortar. But of course it gets there a bit quicker, and critically, as I said earlier, you can make them artificially by putting in 5% of a porcelain. It had less initial shrinkage. That was the incentive, yeah? Not really that it was more durable or anything else. This is the BSE, the European Union standard, which we obviously have adopted, BS 890. So this is what we're looking at. Now this is a false test, you know, it's done by weight. It's done with a sand you would never use, but it's again, one that can be reproduced in every lab in Europe easily. So it's put into just random bag numbers because it doesn't, but of course, all of these fit in this overlap. So they're all to standard, whatever strength they are. This, Historic England are very clear. This standard is utterly unfit for purpose. It tells the user absolutely nothing. This is for producers, yeah, to make sure they're making it. And the other thing, on test, of course, a lot of these don't even reach these strengths after 28 days. In reality, when you make a real mortar, they don't. It's only in the lab when it's done by weight. So it's all weird and it tells you nothing. But however, Historic England tested all the ones that we use, made a mortar, a real mortar with real sand at 1 to 2, the leanest proportion that NHLs would be ever, 1 to 2. And this is the air lime control made with lime putty, sadly, instead of hot mix. I think the hot mix one would be up here, but still flattening and so on. So I think you can see there's an issue here, that every single brand is a different strength on this day. That's the only flaw in this research. This is the strength these brands were on that day. The simplest research, little project they did, as an example, they bought 2 bags of the same natural hydraulic lime, same number, in 2 different parts of England on the same day, had them tested in 2 labs, independent. Sorry?
Same producer as well.
Yeah, same, no, exactly the same brand. Yeah, had them tested in 2 parts of England on the same day, and in both cases, the result was that one of them delivered a mortar that was 30% stronger than the other. So that's the extent of variability, as Boynton said earlier, that's the extent of variability within the same source. But then you move out and you look at, well, these are from different, look at the variation here. So I can tell you now, just to keep it quick, the lowest, the weakest, or just about the weakest on, is an NHL 3.5, St. Astier. The strongest, right up here, is an NHL 3.5, Round Tower. It's not a 5 and it's not a 2. And all I'm trying to show you here, not only this variability, why would you use, because what architect says use this particular brand, this number, it's NHL 3.5. And in fact, in the UK, the cheapest are the worst. One of the cheapest is the Cecil from Portugal, 3% free lime. They're even breaking the standard. The standard demands a minimum of 15% free lime in a 5, 25% minimum in a 3.5, and so on. What you do find in their product is in their NHL 5, 15% limestone dust. Well, natural hydraulic lime definition, you don't add anything to it, yeah? 15% limestone. In their 3.5, 25% limestone dust. Again, exploiting ignorance about what free lime is. Free lime is lime, not limestone dust, yeah? And they get away with it. And as a recent analysis that just looked at the free lime I saw, 3% free lime. It's a natural cement, which they're seeking to mitigate, to make it look like, anyway. So, And that's the most commonly used in Britain. That's around here somewhere. It's in here, Singleton Birch. It goes under an English brand name and the Portuguese brand name. But nonetheless, I don't think I need to say more. And the other thing to say is look at the period of maximum strength gain. You know, the 28-day strength test is for Portland cement, because that's the period of maximum strength gain in Portland cement, the first 28 days. It'll develop typically 95% of its strength in those first 28, unless it's gauged with lime, in which case it's then 3 months is the setting time. But, and you know, in old, not that old books, 1950s, 60s, it's well understood that you didn't just put Portland cement mortar in a wall and walk away. It needed ongoing hydration for 28 days for it to set properly. Spraying it, or a concrete floor, I've seen the specs, lay Hessian on, pour buckets of water on that floor for 28 days. Feeding it during that period of maximum strength gain. If we apply that logic to NHL, we should be wetting these materials every day for 6 months after placement. And interestingly, VCAR, the prompt, which is not a natural hydraulic lime, it's a natural cement, but essentially the mineralogy, the ingredients are the same, there's just no free lime left. They cure their samples that they develop their technical data from underwater for 6 months. And then they test it. And I would actually argue that these materials can only get the hydration they need to really set properly underwater for the first period of their set. It's not enough to spray them for a couple of days, believe me. The likely consequence of that, because we see it in Britain, is that a mortar that looks set on the face, dig in, it's not mortar inside, it's powder or it's mush. It's certainly not mortar. So if they set fully properly, you give them all that, they're going to be far too hard and far too little capillary active to keep the building dry. If you don't do that, they're not a mortar that can get rid of moisture, they just let it in. And it builds and builds and struggles to get out. So I hope that's shocking to everyone in the room, yeah? And the other thing to say is, yes, we've got 6 months of maximum period of strength gain, but then we've got steady climbing curves, which are typically gaining half an MPa every year. And that's half an MPa gain in strength and an equivalent, not equivalent, but a lowering in the porosity that it does have, a densification of the pores system. That's what's happening. So they might be, you know, sometimes first pointed, the building doesn't look wet. It maybe takes a year or 2 years for it to start to build and build. And as I think I've shown you, 20 years, we're in trouble. Yeah, we really start to see the consequences. By which time it might be too late for a limestone that's been having to do all the work and collecting salt in its arises. They're going to powder away. But anyway.
What happened after 1,000 days?
Sorry?
What happened after 1,000
Well,
days?
the testing stopped.
In time, 20 years,
Well,
30 years.
exactly that. And we, as I say, at the very least, we have the right to say to any producer who's selling us this, tell me when this strength gain stops, or I won't buy your product.
Portland cement is about 70 years and it starts going down.
Yeah, well, actually, wait and see. Cement lines are different, put it that way. So this is the Historic England position on this with the standard. There's no equivalence between the historic classifications. Standard mortar mixes are not representative. Testing at 28 days, not representative. Curing regime for NHL suppresses strength development, although you'll see in a minute, most of them, their NHL2 is their strongest mortar. The classification is too wide. Little realistic information for end users. BSE N49 is not suitable as a tool for specifying NHL binders. That is the position of Historic England. This standard is not fit for purpose. So anyone who uses standards as a comfort blanket, this is not a comfort blanket. It's full of holes and you'll get very cold. So, sorry, I just made that one up actually, but anyway. So a bit more detail here. This is over time, but you can see they did 116. Whoa, 10 MPa, 129. But this is the pattern, and the USBA standards identified this too. Cement line mortars reach the maximum, and then their strength drops. Yeah, you just said that, did you? Is that what you said? But this is after 3 months. They've reached maximum strength after 3 months, typically. These are metakaolin gauge mortars, CL90, so airline with metakaolin, and you can see there's their strength there, and look, blimey, There's no, the NHLs are all stronger than that, is the point we're making, and so on. So, and this is all, obviously you're going to get this slideshow, but this is only after a year, bear in mind. And so at that point, the 129, which comes in at about 4 MPa, oh no, it's 2 there. Oh, I'm wrong about that then. That is, oh no, that's the metakaolin mixes, sorry. I'm getting confused. That's the ordinary airline mix. That's where I'm at. This is the 129, and yeah, it's stronger than most of them. After 3 years, it is not. It's weaker than most of them because they're continuing to gain strength. And 129, I would say, is too strong. Trusar, again, we are much more certain to obtain uniform results with hydraulic mortars composed of fat lime, sand, and trass, brick, tile, whatever, pozzolan, than those that we can make of artificial or natural hydraulic lime and sand only. So, this belief that was more reliable and more predictable, and I won't dwell there. And then if we look to the river walls of the Houses of Parliament, Barry, the architect, so the hydraulic materials he's using there, 1 measure of the best burned feebly hydraulic lime, that is, so maybe 4%, 5% clay, 1 measure of finely ground genuine Italian pozzolan, and 2 measures of sharp above bridge sand. That is the water line being used on the Houses of Parliament in the 1850s. 1849 is it? I don't know. But anyway, and it's hot mixed. He makes that clear as well, as with the other mortars. So pozzolans, it was really John Smeaton who was the first to understand that it was fired clay that gave this reaction. No one knew before, they just knew they sat underwater. And so they typically used the whole of the aggregate was trass, as we saw with Batty Langley right at the beginning. The whole aggregate is pozzolanic, but you're wasting money. There's only, 1 pozzolan by weight will combine with 2 parts of lime, and then that's it. There's no more combination, so the rest is aggregate. So Smeaton made it his business to go around identifying the pozzolans that were available. These were known already, but they didn't know why they worked. Pumice, volcanic ash, pozzolan from Mount Vesuvius, trass, volcanic ash, minions, which is calcined ironstone. We have mortars made with that on the North York Moors where they're burning ironstone. The aggregates are just the waste from the kiln. So you've got everything mixed in, calcined ironstone, fuel ash, and so on. And they don't make hard mortars, this is the point. They make mortars you can snap and that are quite openly porous. Not that one in particular, I mean. Coal cinders, coal ash, brick and tile dust, wood ash, Smith's Forge ashes, iron filings. And yeah, that's true. I've seen elevations full of little orange rust dots. Well, they just used iron filings as a pozzolanic addition. And that's where blacksmith's forge ashes, of course, they're a mixture of fuel ash and iron that's been beaten out of the iron. So modern pozzolans, we've got slate dust, microsilica, calcined china clay, metakaolin, and PFA. These are mostly, leaving aside that one, these are typically 89% more powerful than traditional pozzolans. So bear that in mind. They're very powerful compared to traditional pozzolans.
What do you mean by powerful?
Well, their hydraulic energy is 89% more. So they'll make a harder mix and maybe get there quicker, but is that a good thing?
What does 89% more?
The hydraulic energy in the modern pozzolans. They're more energetic, as VK would say. And then Smeaton was the one who said, okay guys, you're wasting your time you're wasting money using 3 parts of pozzolanic material to 1 lime. You only need 1 part of quicklime, 2 parts of sharp sand, 1 part of pozzolan. He didn't know the chemistry of it, but he was absolutely right. There is no point. If you want your water to set underwater, 30% of the aggregate should be pozzolan, and that will leave no free lime if it all combines, won't necessarily, and so on. So just a few examples. Lastly, are we all right? Am I way over time? This is a clay, pebbles, cobbles laid in earth. This was a project, and rats had been through big time, yeah? So you had all these cavities and everything else. The contractor filled those cavities with NHL and then laid the cobbles in NHL. This is a natural wetting in winter, the humidity rising, but I just want to make the point. The moisture, the capillary active moisture is coming through the clay. They look as they might as well be dry because there is no capillary movement through that material, yeah? And we need that. So, And just briefly, concrete, as I say, but you can read those. I've shown you that one. This is on the same site. They rebuilt this porch with NHL 3.5. I think we can all agree the mortar is not managing the salts in that structure. The stone is having to do it. And that's a disaster for that stone in the longer term, yeah? Recent repointing with NHL in Wakefield, before they've now switched over, everything will be done by hot mixes. And already after 2 years, where we've got moisture coming up, the stone is starting to powder. This is after 2 years, yeah? It's being lifted off by salt activity because the mortars are not behaving, they're not taking those salts. Again, Lincoln Castle, this is a new build. And, the architect thinking, oh, it's great, lime's breathable. We don't need a damp-proof member. We don't need a damp-proof course because it's all breathable. It's NHL. This isn't just salt on the surface. This is powdering limestone. And this is 2 years after build. You go inside where they put a limecrete floor, and a limecrete floor made with NHL is not breathable, okay? Don't think it is. I mean, even the Historic England thing about floors 2012 says, if you're using NHL or cement to make your floor slab, you do not need a plastic membrane because they're not, nothing's going to come through them, yeah? So they're the membrane. So that's happening, and inside the walls are just bursting apart with salt and so on. This is the curtain wall of Lincoln Castle. It's saturated. That was pointed with NHL 3.5. 2 million quid, maybe 1.5. I might be exaggerating there. 1.5 million quid, curtain wall of the castle. Not only all this bleeding of the NHL, that wall is permanently saturated, that wall is the only dry bit of that wall, I say, is the medieval core that's exposed there, which they didn't point, all right? But, and this is a constant hazard in what I'm doing. I use this slide, made these points. The architect who specified the work was sat in the audience. But instead of coming and punching me in the face, he came afterwards and said, I know, what do we do? He said, now we have to, every winter, they've had to employ a bloke every day to walk the perimeter wall and pick up all the stone faces that have dropped off in the frost overnight. This is a disaster. Yeah, I mean, this is disastrous, yeah? £1.5 million quid. So anyway, yeah, those are those issues. Again, this is NHL. We've got the bricks taking the salts, not those. This is a job we did in York. This is Holy Trinity, but not the medieval porch. But as you can see from the erosion that had happened already, a heavy salt burden had been pointed with cement. So when we first pointed, we didn't use white mortars. This is all the salts, but they're being drawn into the mortars and sitting on the face. In an extreme salt contamination, those mortars might go friable quite quickly. However, now, some years on, the mortars are still there, the salts have all gone, right? So that is the job of the mason. And if, as I say, an extremist, to fail in preference to the stone, that's the job. But actually, in most cases, they won't. They'll just get that salt out and so on. This slide has persuaded more architects than any other in the world. But sorry.
I think we should.
Yeah, I'm
because certain times they are closing the park.
Yes, no, I'm very, very nearly there. Believe me, I'm not. Just a few more, but that one. This is NHL 5, and that was how it was, and that is 2 weeks after repointing it with a hot mix. That sold more architects than any other slide, I have to be honest, because and they're still NHL 5, and this one was taken after 24 hours of rain on that gable that had stopped about an hour before, right? So, yeah, and then I'll just skip through. Round earth, you do not want NHL on it. That was rendered with NHL 3.5. It's an ugly coping, but you can't say it was letting water in. And that chalk, that's round chalk earth building, just collapsed because of the building moisture in it that it can't deal with. And that's the case with all earth buildings. We cover them in NHL, that earth will reach the liquid limit one day and just slump out of the wall. So, and just a warning on gauge mixes. This is way back we did this church, 2001. And that's just when we started, my boss saying, right, we've got to use NHL. I wasn't happy, but so we did half NHL 2, so Assaye, the weakest you can get, half line putty, 2 limestone, so again more porosity in the aggregates, 4 sand, and this is 20 years later, where there had already, as you can see, been a heavy salt burden, but that has not behaved sacrificially. A mortar which I would have thought was pretty high in free lime, and the stone has continued to erode. So a word of caution about gauged, because again, it doesn't avoid the ongoing strength gain in the NHL component. And that building there, as a whole, is a wet building. It wasn't wet when we started. When I came back, I went through my report. It was actually dry, and it probably, in retrospect, had been pointed with a cement lime mortar. Yeah. So just very quickly, cement lime mortars, I'm not going to dwell. Where's the damage? Where's the absence of sacrificial behaviour? Again, in Calgary, cement, a little bit of cement added to a hot mix in this period. This Rudge Chapel, a limestone building in Lincoln, Nebraska, very defective detailing, which led to sacrificial behaviour in the cement lime mortars. Subsequently then, they've gone in, oh, we'll point that with just sand and cement. That's why it's in distress. And because of the poor detailing, it lets the water run down these buttresses rather than shedding it off. So again, that's being done right now with cement lime mortars in Nebraska. And hey, that is the end. Yeah, by the look of it, yeah. So that gives you some how easy it is to confuse that with a lime an applied finish coat if you don't understand that lime wash was thick. Right, put that somewhere safe. I mean, I'm not sure it'll survive.
I haven't got somewhere safe.
Yeah, down there, between them things, that'll do. That's a traditional storage place.
I'll try and hold it, but that's usually it, it's on the shelf.
Just so you know,
Yeah.
we have here landline.
Yeah. Yep.
We have here another supplier that is actually produced here.
Right.
Lamb and like
Yeah, a mixture of the two, yeah.
wood
Ah, great.
powdered wood lime.
Yep.
That's lime dust, lime sand,
Right, yeah.
which I like.
Yeah. More lump lime.
More.
Powdered.
That's the lime body made.
Ah, right, yeah, okay.
And some of these, I'll bring some of
That's the limestone aggregate, yeah.
The coarser one also.
Yeah, and the silica sand, yeah?
That's the ceramic water.
Right.
And I was thinking maybe we'll also mix lime.
No, we are going to, we are doing an earth lime, yeah.
מה יחסית? שאלה אחד, אבל האגרגטים פה הם מעמיסים.
No, it wouldn't hurt.
כאילו זה. לא. סיסי. גיביתי, בשתי, הכנתי. וואו, נייס. מה שנקרא full circle.
Just leave that, just to gobble up that water, I feel. I mean, I think if I dug down, I'd get what I want anyway. It's just on the top. But
That's already out, wasn't it?
So you would call that putty?
this is lime
That's
putty, as they meant, and it could be stiff.
Not putty.
Putty. Putty. Right. But anyway, no, I'm just, because we did wet that up a bit, wetter than it needed to be, but right, okay, we've got some earth. What we haven't got is a gauge at the moment.
Just use it.
But I think either you'll be coming back here probably with a gauge. Just leave the lid off, Maria, because I want to be able to see what it is when I get going. Yeah, that's had an effect, hasn't it?
והטענה שלה, אני לא הבנתי רק הדלי הזה, אני חושב פאדי זה פלסטלינה. לא, אבל כאילו הבנתי שאתה עושה
לפי התנועות של המזכירים שלו רואים שהוא בנאי ולא דייר.
I'm not sure what that is. It was with that, but I don't know.
No idea. For the water, you can.
Yeah.
You can pour water through it.
So you could put all your sand and quicklime in, put that on top, and yeah.
We're not safe, we don't have it.
With no risk.
Yeah, we're in a bit of a wind tunnel. We'll have to bear that in mind. But, Ely, we need a gauge, a measure. Have you?
אני לא מכיר את זה, כאילו, הקטע של סיגריה טבק,
Man, this is something from England they just dug out of the dirt here. Looks like open hill or משהו כזה.
Oh, right. Interesting.
It's a lid.
Is it a English Crusaders? Right, okay, we're just waiting for a gauging, a measure, that's all. Is he going to get one? That's nice, I want to keep that. Yeah.
I have a question. First stage for me.
It's acid versus alkaline, that's the point, yeah.
That's an excuse.
How did you decide on the dirt you're using? You use just whatever's here?
Yeah, and I'm not sure this is a subsoil, but we're doing it just to show you the change that happens, I think, is the primary thing. I mean, if very often if you, I mean, certainly if you're building with earth itself, you tend to wet it up the night before, so it gets fully hydrated, and it helps the clays get hydrated. In Bhutan, where they build everything with earth, they just have heaps of the earth out in the weather all winter, so it's getting wet all the time, and then it's fairly plastic. But so that's best practice, is to wet it before. But no, I mean, there are different ways, but we're not putting a lot of lime in. And really, what's happening, I'm going down Science Road, but a clay and a lime, they combine, they exchange ions, whatever. So they make a lock. It's not entirely pozzolanic, although Boynton says it is pozzolanic. Obviously, scientists say, well, no, that's not been fired clay, so it doesn't. But Robert Boynton, who's a very good chemist, is absolutely certain that it is a pozzolanic reaction, but very feeble, very weak. But whatever way they do it, the lime and the clay combine together, so you're creating a mixed binder. And so typically 12% clay, and you're adding 10% quicklime, so you can see that is a pozzolanic relationship in volume terms. And so in general, you're not waiting for a earth lime mortar or plaster to carbonate, because there will be some carbonation, as there even is in cement concrete, of course, ultimately. But the real setting mechanism is really a drying mechanism, so it's quite a different thing. But I'm going to do it upside down, because we'd probably historically you would put the lime in there, slake it on its own, and then mix it up together. I mean, equally, I could do it with lime putty straight away, you see. And a very common proportion in France, where they go into much more detail, is 1 slate lime to 5 earth. That's a very common, so less than 20%, 15%, 16%, something like that. But as you saw, it can be richer than that. It's not. It's up to the masons really, and what they preferred and what they were doing with it and so on. But I just want to give you some. So I'm going to wet it beyond, and I instead of slaking the lime on its own, which is really the best way of doing it, in terms of getting the heat of the slake, I am going to wet this right up to show you what it's like as a mortar, as an earth mortar, and then I'm going to sprinkle quicklime in, and that obviously is not going to get quite as hot as it would, but we've never seen an issue in earth lime mortars because it could just as easily be slate lime. You'd get the same response in the material. So, but that's my normal method, and I've not ever found that to be a problem in performance terms. But so I will put some more water in and take it up to and beyond the liquid limit. So I don't, just a little bit that I don't do that fully to, just to give you some idea of the plasticity of it and so on, the nature of it with just water and earth. And you can see it's not a bad thing, that's quite nice, but it's going to show as visible water all the time in that scenario. But it's not a bad building mortar, you can see. But I'm now going to just take it beyond the liquid limit. And we've seen a bit what it was like then. And this is the trowel I tend to use, this style of trowel. It's a Marshalltown, but it is based on the British bricklaying trowel, and the size of it too. They weren't giant. The big one. Well, ours too. Philadelphia trowel, as we call it, or they are big, but you can imagine with the, well, you will imagine in a minute, with these materials, your wrist can't cope. You've got a great big trowel like that, but you'll see I could pick up as much water as I want on this trowel. So, okay, so that's that. And then if we go to the powdered quicklime, which, oh, sorry, is that one? Yeah. And that's not, I don't need that much. And you can see that is slaking, so I could let that will reach temperature now if I just let it slake a little while. So again, if you remember what we were reading, lime which slakes the fastest is the best. And it's only the purest lime that will slake really fast, and that started to slake, what? Within a microsecond of contact with water. I mean, that's how quick.
How is the lime in Israel, you find?
Well, I mean, we've been using Turkish lime burned from marble, actually, and that's really nice. I mean,
that's the product that we get.
I mean, this thing about predictability, that's the other, I didn't make that point explicitly, but the point really is that within small margins, quicklime is the same everywhere it occurs. You know, I could go to India, I could go anywhere, and as long as I've got a mainly pure quicklime, I know it without knowing it, you know, because the response is the same. And so again, it increases that predictability of the material and that knowability of it.
The lime tells you, I guess, how good it is.
Absolutely, yeah. And you'd quickly know if it wasn't good. That's the point. It's what? Less.
Not heating up.
The less, I mean, the more impure it is, the slower that slate would be. So some of the feebly hydraulic limes, and we can get, there is a feebly hydraulic lime, CL80, coming in from Germany at the moment as a powder from Otterbein, the German company in Britain. But because it doesn't meet the standard, they can't say that it's a feebly hydraulic lime. But it clearly is. It's CL80. So what's the other 20%? It's impurity of some kind. And I kind of know it is because even when it's very fresh, you do what we've just done, and it won't get hot for about 5 minutes. So that same delay can happen if the lime is old and has been in that tub for a long time. Then it can slow a little.
What do you mean by old? Like a year, 2 years?
Sorry?
How much is old for the...
Oh, well, these days, I mean, the powder quicklime that I use typically is comes in plastic bags, so the air just cannot get in. Okay. The shelf life of that is indefinite. I mean, I've slaked from those bags 3 years old, you know, and it's still the same, but that relies on the plastic bag, yeah? I mean, that's the
tub like this with a well-sealed lid.
The thing is, even if you've got half a tub of quicklime, half of it is air, and that can have a slight effect on its. But you certainly learn these. This material teaches you these things when you use it. It's not, you don't need to know the theory of it, but.
Why did you choose the powder, not the chunks?
In this case, because I wanted to show you the difference between the wet earth and then on its own, and then with the lime added. That's the only reason, really. No, you could have used lump and but it wouldn't have been much, and you'd just slake it. It would fall, and then you'd mix it in. You'd slake it on its own initially. The benefit of powder in general is, as you can see, I can put it straight in with the aggregate and mix it. That's one of the benefits of it. And I would say historically, the purpose of the ordinary method is simply to reduce the lump lime to a size that you can mix with sand. That's all. It's a practical thing. It's pragmatic. It's got no other purpose. But of course, with it being slaked on its own, you guarantee the minimum necessary temperature, which we'll be talking about in a minute, and which I haven't observed here, although that is hot in places. So, but I think you can see, and I don't think there's much clay in this. I might be wrong, but nonetheless, it's mud. And you can see that's of a very different consistency to the earth on its own. And that's just for the addition of that lime. And you can see it's become a squeeze-resistant material, but most particularly as well, and that's just still happening. In a minute, we won't be able to see any water on the surface of that material. All the water is locked in along with the earth and the clay, if there is clay in there. So, and it's a very plastic, workable material, and that's the purpose, really, of putting quicklime in. But the addition of the quicklime makes it more weather resistant, holds the fines on the surface, they don't depart in the rain and so on. So it has lots of purposes, and of course helps increase the capillarity of the material to some extent. But clay, of course, is itself capillary active material. So we've got a double binder in here with the material. And I don't know about you, but I'd be very happy to build with that. I mean, and to plaster with it. And if I'm honest, I prefer to plaster with an earth lime than with a lime sand. I find it a nicer material to use as a plaster in general. If it was a plaster, we would also put in some fibre of some kind. Now, in some parts of the UK and Europe, that can be hair. In my part, as you saw, it's hay, it's grass, and that's to just resist shrinkage.
Do you ever find a soil that's not proper to use?
I'm sure there are, and unfortunately, when it can get a bit scientific, because there's no unquestionably some clay is better than other clay for the purpose, but I try to always keep it down to the practical level. This is stuff being done by practical men and women, and do they care about that? As long as it feels right and does the job, that's what matters. Not its exact chemical. That's interesting, but it's not relevant from the craft perspective. It's whatever works is what is good.
What about 2 years after application? If you use the wrong material, it's very workable, but it doesn't have any.
I never have used the wrong material in that case. Is all I can say.
Everything is good.
I mean, we're lucky in our region. The clay subsoils are very sandy and it's very fine from the beginning, because we live in a area that was a glacial lake, so it's very flat, and then the hills rise away from it. And the subsoils there, because of that, are very fine aggregate, and they got just about the right balance of sand. I mean, the other thing to say is, in most cases as well, it wouldn't be enough to do what we've just done. You would add some sand in there to bring down the clay. If the clay proportion is high, you're adding sand in, and we say improve it. I say improve it. I definitely say the addition of lime is improving it. Earth builders who find it difficult in Britain to accept that there's lime in the mix, because they're earth builders, they argue with the term improved. But as a mason, there is absolutely no question that it's improved by the addition of a bit of lime. That's all I'm going to say on that front. So let's put that one out of the way. Sorry?
Since there's no more aggregates, then do I have problems with cracking and that kind of thing?
No. We can talk about aggregates. I am firmly of the mind that the aggregates we generally use in the conservation world are far too big, far too coarse. We don't see them in old mortars. We see very fine aggregates. Most mortar analysis I have done between 85 and 90% of the aggregate, this is sand aggregate, will pass through a 1 millimeter sieve. And then very often, 80% of that will pass through a 0.5 millimeter sieve. So this is,
Very fine.
and my experience is they will shrink less than one made with a coarse, well-graded sand.
Like that stuff that we
yeah.
have the road.
So this something. When you get into this, you have to, and we need to relearn everything. Do you know what I mean? It's not a lot of this is another rule of the line revival, which is not really sustained by the evidence of the buildings. Put it that way, but you know, so in some places, yes, they do use coarser aggregate, and certainly if you're stuccoing, like in Central Europe, where there's a lot of stucco finishes, and then they are putting big aggregate in, but the mortar is really deep, yeah, for that and so on. So right, okay, we'll do a straight hot mix with stone dust, sand, and lump lime. So.
What if you use a clay-bearing soil that has a salt burden in it? Would that affect the mix in any way?
That might be a problem, but it might not. I mean, it's
depending on how much
lime to lock with the salt, because lime and salt lock together. And when he just said about the eye wash, for that reason, if you get lime in your eye, do not try and rinse it out with saline eye wash. Because that chemical lock will happen in your eye, and it will make it worse. I mean, I've seen it happen, you know. Whereas sugary water, yeah, you put that in your eye within a minute of contact, in most situations you will not know that you had any lime in your eye. You can rinse it out with water, but you will have a red eye for 2 weeks. And Bill Reevy, the material scientist I work with, calculated on the chemistry that sugary water is 80 times more efficient at combating lime than water alone. So you're going to want to use something that's 80 times better, aren't you? So.
How do you translate מים חזקים?
קשים, לא מים חזקים.
מים קשים? לא, מים חזקים.
מים קשים, כי זה מכיל מינרלים גבוה.
Sorry, can we get? I don't know where's silica sand's in here, isn't it? Oh no, sorry, I thought you were saying that.
We don't have it. Do you want a silica sand?
Sorry?
Do you want a silica
I don't know. I don't need it. No, it's fine. So this is another limestone.
Yeah.
To me, that discussion we were just having, this is actually this is limestone aggregate, but that's what they mean very often when they talk. When you see in the text coarse, sharp sand, that's what they mean. Not much coarser than that. And in the USA and Canada, the masonry sands tend to be 3 millimeters down. That's, again, they kind of know better. And 3 millimeters down, and actually in use, for being that, they shrink very little. Whereas if you have a lot of bigger coarse stuff, they shrink more. I didn't realize that until I started using the finer sands, because we think that the finer sands will make it shrink more. But in fact, certainly with quicklime, that's not true. But remember, we're putting in more lime than we have in recent years, so every grain is coated in lime and more, gluing them together when we've got the extra lime. It's the extra lime that makes all the difference to the aggregates, I would say, and the aggregates that you use. And certainly if you've got a mortar that's got lots of coarse sand, that's very easy to snap. If you've got one that's got is all fine sand, much harder to snap. So, you know, the bigger aggregates are kind of cleavage planes within that mortar, I would suggest. You know, I'm still evolving a theory of shrinkage, if you know what I mean, but it's sort of, so that's 2 parts. We'll put some wood ash in, shall we? A little bit. That's one of these, isn't it? Not that one.
It's this one.
Yeah. Oh yeah, it says wood ash.
Just ash, not wood.
So you can see.
For it.
So I'm not going to put much, but I'll put a certain amount and make up the difference with. So you can see we've got charcoal, and that for me that all goes in. If the charcoal's is an irritation when you're pointing, just flick it out, you know, but leave as much in as you can. We see little bits of charcoal in so many mortars, and I have to say there's an idea out there that's from the kiln, from the burn. That's if you burn lime, you know The lime comes out clean. The ash is right down the bottom.
The lumps come clean.
Yeah.
But when you try to gather everything, you pick up.
Yeah, and we have, as you probably know, what they call lime ash floors. That's made with that debris at the bottom, which is a mixture of quicklime that's fallen off the bigger lumps and ashes. And you mix them together, you get a hot mix, and that's a lime ash floor. But if you see those lumps, I am adamant, in most cases, they've been put there by the masons. They're not an accident, yeah? That's all I want to say. So, one of that, and we're just...
for dating.
Absolutely, yeah.
So you're putting 2 of this semolina with one...
Yeah. It's 3 parts in total. It's 3 parts in total, including the wood ash. Yeah. So, okay, so mix that up.
3.1.
Yeah. No, this one's 3.01. So, okay, now, because I'm going to do an ordinary method mix, I'm then going to, having roughly mixed that up, I'm going to clear out a space in the middle.
Is the sand dampened a bit?
I've dampened it deliberately. Yeah.
Because you can use the water, right?
Well, it's partly because we never use dry sand in Britain. It's always wet.
You don't have
And I know there's a slight difference in bulk density one to the other, but you know, we don't want to be too pedantic. Right. So, roughly speaking, and now again, historically, of course, there's two measures in this regard. We talk about a struck level and a fair level. This is a distinction made, because a struck level is fine if you've got a fine material. But in this case, I need a fair level because I need to take account of the voids. And all that really means is that I'm just going to put a bit more than the...
Like a 10.
Very scientific.
Yeah, it's incredibly It's incredibly scientific, yeah. Right, so we put that in and shuffle them around a bit so they get best access to the water I'm going to put in. So now, okay, this is the moment to talk about more slaking water proportion, which is absolutely essential. I'd say there are 2 constants all over the world, 2 things that are absolutely constant. There is variation in aggregates, there's variation in all sorts, but the constant rules is A, mortar proportion, we've discussed that, you know, you want the right proportion, and B is slaking water proportion, slaking method. You'll see in all the old texts they say slake with just sufficient water. That's really helpful to us in the 21st century. But of course, by the end of the 19th century, engineers are putting a figure on what that means. And so, but we can work it out to some extent. In the kiln, in a typical limestone, we have driven off all the carbon dioxide, obviously, and all the water. Now, that typically comes to about, well, the water element of that is typically 30% of the weight. So this comes out of the kiln looking exactly the same, but 30% lighter, essentially. And all the water, to slake that material, to satisfy its demand to have that molecular water back, you know, that was part of its structure, which we artificially drove out in a kiln, we need to give it back a third of its weight in water. And that's all it needs. That's all it needs to slake. And if we do that, it will slake to a dry hydrate. Because we're giving back the water that is part of its structure that we can't see, yeah? That's what the dry powder is that we buy from a builder's merchant, 30% of its weight. That generally translates to 1 volume of water to the volume of quicklime. That weight is typically an equivalent volume. This is all craft stuff, you know, this all evolved over many years. So if we wanted to create a dry hydrated material, we'd give it that 1/3, we'd bank this sand over, it would get hotter perhaps than it would in the other method I am going to use. And then the slaking of that would actually dry the sand out. The heat is enough to dry the sand, and then that would be mixed together. And if you didn't, and the benefit or one of the reasons for dry slaking is that then that material that you've mixed the 2 together, you can throw the whole through a screen to take out the bigger lumps of lime that haven't slaked, but also, of course, to take out big lumps of aggregate. We didn't get it, we weren't. They weren't so lucky as us to get it all nicely screened already, yeah? So there's a double purpose there. And that was most common in the UK, certainly, amongst bricklayers, because their joints are so much finer, yeah? They don't want the bigger lumps. So you'll often see in a bricklayer mortar very small lumps. It's still hot mix indicator, but they've been screened, the bigger lumps have been screened out. Stonemasons, of course, we're working generally with much bigger joints, and if we're filling cores and everything else, we don't care, right? We don't care about lumps. As long as it feels right, that's right. And the lumps, you'll see the much bigger lumps. I mean, I've seen lumps this big in mortars, you know. So, and if you're going to slate straight through to a mortar, which is what I typically do, again, the water volumes matter. And so if we need to give it typically around, it varies slightly with the different limes, 2 volumes of water to the volume of quicklime is a good rule. It can be 2.5 volumes. But if we were to try, and then maybe when we made it to a mortar, we'd want 3 volumes in total in the mortar. You would not put the 3 volumes in when you slake it, because that risks suppressing the temperature of the slate. It's too much water, yeah? And that drowns the lime. You'll see that phrase. If on the other hand, going back one step, if we put much less than a third part of the water in, that then it can get very hot indeed, very fast. You know, we're talking 400, 500 degrees centigrade, very fast, yeah. And that's when you hear people talking about danger, that is dangerous, clearly. But that's if you're doing it wrong, yeah, you see what I mean? And the consequence of that, and they call that burning the lime, that's not a bad thing necessarily in and of itself, but if you've only put a little bit in, and you've raised the temperature up to 400 degrees, and then you're going to add cold water, it chills the lime. That's the consequence of burning, really. And if you chill this lime, wherever it is at the point of contact with that cold water, and it's very, very hot, it stays exactly at that point. It won't slake anymore, typically. I would hasten to say, however, that that's not why we have lumps in the mortar. Yeah? That's not because they chilled the lime. You can tell straight away if you mixed it through, it feels short, as we and the Americans say. The mortar feels short, hasn't got enough binder in it. You can tell straight away if it's happened.
You were so skinny.
Right, okay, yeah, well, very similar. So I'm going to give it those 2, and in this method, you tend to give it all in one go, not incrementally, because of the risk of burning and chilling. And you don't stir it, you leave it, we'll do it anyway, I won't keep describing it. Let's do it.
Let's do it.
So there's a possibility that this might spit at you just in the first second, but you've got glasses on. That's because it's a modern quicklime. I'll just put a tiny drop more. And now, as quickly as I can, I'm going to bank that over, because I need to keep the heat and the spirit of the lime in. It's escaping at the moment. Come back. And then, yeah, pack that down.
How much water do you add?
About 2.25 volumes to the volume of the lime. Yeah, to 1. Just keep, it's a happy situation that actually these volumes are very similar to the mixing volumes. It's a 1 to 2, 1 to 3. Yeah, so just keep those 2 figures, 1 to 3, 1 to 2 in your head. If I gave it 3, that wouldn't drown the lime. So, you know, and it may be that this one wants 3. You know, what the engineers say, and it's Gilmore in particular goes into this in great detail. You know, when you start with a new lime, when you come to a new quicklime, find out how much it needs exactly, you know, before you start working with it. That's all. It's just a simple experiment to see how much it needs to end up as a thick paste. So that first method with just a third is going to give you a dry powder. The objective is to have a thick paste. And there will be some powder, but you know, again, if we got it exactly right, it would just be a thick paste, yeah? So, and as I say, I can't emphasize how important that is that I was saying, because to maximize the surface area and the porosity of the lime that we produce, we need this slate to reach a minimum of 100 degrees centigrade. Is that to add to that?
Hydrate you unless you turn the
Yeah, I do need hydration. I'll get burned otherwise, won't I? But right, you can see it's still slaking. So this is a good idea. You can tell when it stops because the expansion cracking stops. I mean, if this was a finer lump, we'd get more obvious expansion. But of course, in this case, the lime is expanding into the voids between itself because of the larger lump. Yeah. So it's not apparent increasing that volume by that much, but sometimes we'll get it growing to about this size. So, but I stress you would not use this method to slake powder quicklime. Okay, that can be a hazard. Yeah, because you could potentially get a build-up of steam underneath the lime, and it can suddenly go bop. Yeah, pressure. So I'm going to show you the method for powder next, but this is the ordinary method in a small scale. I mean, obviously they'll be doing this as typically a square meter, a cubic meter, I mean, at a time with shovels and then with hose at the end when they've got the water in just to temper it and work it up to a nice fatty material. But yeah, well.
Is there a reason the old texts talk about slaking it with, or beating it down to equal for 8 hours?
There is. We don't fully understand the reason, and in a way we're too lazy to really want to find out, but no, there is an explanation, and it's relevant to what we've been talking about. It's only one, Dagmar Makinova, I believe her name is. She's the equivalent of the National Trust or whatever in Czech Republic. She looked at it in the case of putty lime, because this is some years ago. But interestingly, what she demonstrated, the act of beating, and you can see that in the Yemen where they're beating lime putty. Why? Is what happens in the process of beating is that you reduce the volume, the proportion of bigger non-capillary pores, and you magnify the volume of 1 micron pores. She didn't know the significance of that when she did that research. But of course, so you're increasing the capillarity by doing that. And they always say, that, as you will have read, that the process of doing it makes a stronger mortar. But what does that mean? Maybe more frost resilient? Well, that too, perhaps, yeah. No, and the other thing, as I say, yeah, if you've mixed to a dry hydrate, that almost needs a lot of beating to bring it to the same workability as we will get for doing it wet in the first place. Yeah, it needs more beating to bring it to the fattiness that you want. So yeah, those are, I think, are the two reasons, but we're still open to finding out other reasons, But I think that's really important, that idea that it's bringing down. When they say stronger, the more capillary active pores you've got, the more frost resilient the material will be, because the sooner it'll get rid of water that might freeze. That might be what they mean by stronger. Do you know what I mean? We don't know. It's a matter of interpretation. And we've still got some expansion going on here, so. Well, they religiously.
It's defreezing.
They religiously used it hot in the winter and wet the background very little. We've got record of that in the depths of winter. But they are working in the depths of winter in Norway and so on very often. Laying bricks. It's very rare that you'll lose. But if you're building a wall that thick, it's vulnerable. Yeah, in the winter because it's not going to lose its water quick enough. But not necessarily. I mean, you'll see a lot. They'll say, "Well, you need to protect the wall because it's winter," and then the next sentence is, "Leave a plank of wood on top of the wall." That's the protection. But that makes sense because the one thing you really, really don't want is a feed of water into the core of the wall because that will make it frost vulnerable. Yeah, it's not being able to get to stiffen down by suction from the stone that you've got in, and all of that. Yeah. So, but again, given that once these fat lime mortar is in the wall, you don't wet it again because of its water retentivity. You don't need to. We did have to wet 1 to 3 line putty because its water retentivity is much lower. Then you can see that in the winter, it's getting rid of its water. I mean, I've pointed in snowstorms, on gables on my own house. I wouldn't do it commercially just in case, but it's not been a problem in the middle of winter, And so I'm not saying it's an iron rule, but anyway, you don't have to worry about frost, do you? I mean, this is a big discussion in England, But whereas, as I say, again, in the winter, even in the winter, the hydraulic lines need a lot of hydration, so they're always going to be frost vulnerable. And yet the argument in Britain is, in the winter, use natural hydraulic lime, but it should be the other way around. And we're proving, like the jobs have shown, we're proving that all the time. These materials can be worked with in the winter, you know, without any risk of damage, really, as long as you exercise common sense, you know. Right, okay, well, I'm satisfied that's pretty much done. So I'm now going to break in there and see what we've got. And there's a bit of underburned lime, you can see straight away. It's not slaked and it's got a grey core. That's what a piece of underburned lime will present as grey. It's just not had the heat in there. And I clearly could have put a bit more water, but yesterday it was all right. So we did get paste, and there is our thick paste, yeah? And it's pretty bloody hot, okay, but I can still handle it, that's the point. And the other thing about these volumes of water, particularly the 2.5, is that whatever the ambient temperature, those volumes will give you 100 degrees centigrade in the slate, yeah? So again, it's a craft thing that it doesn't matter what time of year it is, those volumes will give you what you want. And of course, we need 100 degrees to generate the steam, which we think helps to slake the material as well, and in a good way.
So you're saying, in terms of, how do I phrase it? You're saying when it's steam slaked, its properties are a bit different?
The evidence is beginning to seem to show that, yes. I mean, the structure that grows.
The sense of workability is the same in my opinion.
Oh yeah, no, I'm sure, but I mean, bear in mind, we have these debates in the lime world and in the conservation world, but I talked to the commercial lime producer and they slake powdered, the quick lime you buy, they slake it with steam. They know this already. And so again, this idea that we've had in the lime revival that dry hydrated lime is crap is not true. It's not sustainable. It is if we don't put enough of it in, but mixed to the right proportion, it's a perfectly good, I mean, in fact, it's probably the best material, because it's really done in a quality controlled environment and it's slaked with steam. And I've spoken to them, they aim to slake at a temperature between 100 and 120 degrees centigrade, so they know everything. And actually, I mean, that minimum temperature stuff I got from the modern industry, not from historic texts. You saw, they're just saying as hot as possible, whatever that means. But they knew you needed steam, so that is a minimum of 100 degrees. Yeah, do you know what I mean? So okay, I made this a little wet yesterday because there's a lot more water in than I think, as with lime putty, yeah? So I don't want to make that mistake today, because I want to deliver a mortar that's more of a pointing mortar. So,
but it's much harder to mix when it's. I mean, you can get it to the consistency you want. It wouldn't come right though like that.
Yeah, no, I'm not. Oh wait! Oh, look at that!
Beat it.
I'm just going a little bit, but that's what we do in the modern world. We use water to achieve workability, whereas they use elbow grease, as we say, sweat.
Yes, we use this. What you're saying is it's not right to add water.
No, I'm not saying it's wrong. It's just it invites the more shrinkage potential. That's all. And if you beat it from about where we were, without adding any more water, you can bring it fairly quickly to that workability without the extra water, and that's the better thing to do because there's less water in there to promote shrinkage, yeah? So that, if you've got the patience. But of course, that's why they use roller mixers. Roller mixers do the beating for you, and it didn't rely. And of course, you see, and even there I've overdone the water a bit. Not for, depending what I'm going to do with it, but... I mean, on that beating... Oh, I won't. So right, the consistency of that, that's a good bedding mortar. It's a good plaster. It's too wet for pointing. Yeah, that's. But if I'm going to, I can also feel there's still quite a lot of lime to slake there, so I'm going to set that down, and that will stiffen in the next 5 or 10 minutes to a different consistency.
You can make this part in the mixer?
Oh yeah, no, I'll talk to you about that. Yeah, yes, and Ely and Yossam have. Okay then. Right, hold on. Okay, so there we've got what I would consider to be a very workable mortar myself. I mean, some might disagree. Very sticky, and again, it's very cohesive. And I'm going to see if I can demonstrate the cohesiveness by picking up pretty much the whole of that up on a trowel. Yeah.
Let's see.
So you don't need a big trowel. That's the cohesiveness being demonstrated. Let's see what we can do on the adhesiveness front. Not great, but let's give it just a little tap. And yeah, that's what we want, isn't it? I don't know. I mean, you tell me. That is what we want, isn't it? And of course, if you haven't got enough lime, if some of the lime isn't, maybe it's slaked already, say, you can tell. But if it's not like that, you need a little bit more lime. Yeah, that's simple as that, really. Right, so that's that method.
How about a lime paint?
Oh, well, I'll do the powdered mix version, the method for the powder, but I'll put this into there at the moment. And then
How do you mix the big quantity?
we'll talk about that in a minute. Yeah, they all translate to a mixer. It's just, I do it like this so you can see what's going on, you know. Yeah, a pan mixer, yeah. Or a roller pan mixer, one or the other. Those, you can do it, but not so good. Yeah, not so great. Okay, same mix. Oh, sorry, I didn't know there was still water in there.
Oh well.
אבל Nigel, there's they say winter sometimes. I know, I'm sorry, but this lake sometimes you want to use hot water.
That's particularly in the case of hydraulic lime. It will speed the slow slake of a hydraulic lime to use hot water. Yeah.
So even cold water could be fine.
Yeah, that's again what these proportions are designed for. That cold water will take you to 100 degrees centigrade minimum. That's why those proportions are there. It's also why I'm stressing the importance of it. These are the only iron rules in what we're doing, is slaking water proportion and mortar proportion. The rest is, the world is your oyster. In my experience, any aggregate will do when you do this. But anyway, right, so again, very similar mix proportion-wise, aggregate-wise. And I am going to wet that a bit before I put the powder in. Partly because I'm so used to wet sands, I feel uncomfortable if they've not got a bit of moisture. Yeah, but sorry. Yeah.
What would be the issue if you walk in and then
It'd be a little more elastic, that's all. Perhaps more stretchy. Some people prefer it that way, but some do, yeah. And it doesn't matter. It's just
this is what characteristic
yeah.
the material won't change.
No, I don't think it does in the. Right. Okay. So this will start to slake down the bottom as soon as I put the powder in. But And of course, in this case, a struck level is appropriate, yeah? So I put that in, and immediately, this is the difference, immediately mix those together. The slake has already started because of that little bit of moisture I put in, and that's partly why I did it, really. I'm very conscious. You can let this go on a while, but you'll come a point where it goes to a super fine dust, and with the wind direction, it'll blow in his direction. But again, you might have seen they talk in this method of adding the water a bit more incrementally, typically. But there is absolutely no reason why you can't put 2 volumes in straight away, just like that. It's not going to drown it. But if you leave it, look, it starts to acquire a pyroclastic flow. It's reaching and it's gone to a super fine dust. So it was already a fine powder, now it's gone to an even finer powder, which again is more surface area, so better bond. So I'm going to have to get this is sorry. Say that again. Right. Okay. So I'm going to go with 2. Because the rule historically is you never add lime to water. You always add water to lime. I know what you're saying because the iron rule in the lime revival is the other way. Is the total opposite of that. And that's because if you do it the other way around, there is a risk that you'll drown it. And the guys specifying it don't trust us not to drown it because it makes it easier to mix. They don't trust the craftsman. That's one of the reasons it is, but it's not. It's about temperature of the slake again. You can safely get that temperature if you add the water to the quicklime, not the other way around, yeah?
What do Middle Eastern countries do in the summer when they're snaking? I mean, it's...
Well, the same, but... Yeah. Well, the only thing I say, you'll get more rapid slaking because the ambient temperature is already higher. Do you know what I mean? And you're not right. I mean, it's not that they never would slake pure lime with hot water just because it speeds the slake. I mean, if your water is 80 degrees centigrade and you need a minimum temperature of 100 degrees centigrade, bingo, you know. And there was a piece of research done in the 60s by an American, Miller, and it's the only research of its kind I've ever seen, where he's testing the slaking of limes with different temperature water. And he demonstrated, yeah, if your water is 90 degrees centigrade, it wouldn't drown because it's only got to reach another 10. It's only got to get another 10. So in that case, you could slake it in massive volume of water. But in general terms, slaking with these guarantees the temperature you need without you having to think about it, basically.
And what's burning time? Can you get high temperature?
Yeah. As I said earlier, if you just put a tiny amount of water in, much less than it needs, it gets incredibly hot. Potentially 500 degrees centigrade, as quickly as it's reaching 100. That's not a. Let's just beat it a little bit, but it does need more water. I can tell that, but not a lot more. And that's the thing. You've got to be. There's a tipping point where just a little bit of water will make a huge difference. Put it that way. And there is a chemistry reason for that, but I don't know it.
I am a builder.
I'm a stonemason. Don't think I'm not. Oh yeah. What is it? Yeah, real ones.
No.
Oh, looks like it. See, and there I've gone beyond just that little bit has taken it beyond. So that's telling if I'd had the patience, I could have beat that to the, yeah. However, the slaking isn't complete, so it will in this case. Just that I know it isn't. No, in this case there will be no lumps because it's all powder. So it's all binder. So in relative terms, there is more binder in that than there is in that. because some of that is in lump form and not binder, and we did it at the same proportion. So when they say, again, as you might have seen, they tend to say that if you do it with powder, that produces the strongest mortar of all, as a common phrase. I think it's as simple as the fact that it's all binder, because they're still mixing it at the same proportion. It's not that the method makes it inevitably stronger, yeah? That's what I mean. You've got to be very careful when you read these old texts. It's very easy for us to assume a meaning they're not. Yeah, do you know what I mean? You've got to read between the lines, and that's why I consider it so important that the research that we did was done by a craftsperson who uses the materials, not by an academic who knows nothing about it. Sorry? I don't have a preference. I mean,
For certain jobs.
yeah, I mean, most pointing, I use powder. Powder is what I use most of all. But certainly if I'm building, these days, I have built that big wall I showed. We built that with.
Because you don't want the lumps.
Well, it's not that I don't want them. It's just it's the easiest. It's the most readily available form that we get quicklime. We've only got one supplier that will sell us lump like that. Yeah, and even they're reluctant to sell us lump. It's a pain in the ass. And when you do buy the lump, it comes like that. But that increases the cost because someone's had to put it into those tubs and all that. So, but if you're going to build with it, if I know I'm going to use it within a week or two, then I'll buy it by the ton, and that's half the price as buying it in a plastic bag. So I would build with lump these days and just point with powder. And most of my pointing I do with powder, because it's rare that I'm pointing a building that hasn't lost all its lime mortars. So I've got nothing to match, you know. But in a high quality, high status building, we also get the lump in 5 millimeters down, which is, you can actually mix it by this method or that method, and it will leave you some lumps. So if you want lumps for visual or evidence and so on, I'd use that kibbled rather than the lump, if you see what I mean. You know, but that's in the commercial world, you know. But anyway, this is coming through to something quite nice now. And that's about pointing consistency. It could be a little drier than that for pointing, but again, we've got a very similar mortar. It's not quite as sticky, and that's kind of telling me maybe a little bit more water would be. Do you know what I mean? That it's sort of because it came off so easily. Not that that's a major issue.